3/4 from Heaven, Chapter 1 The Ritual. When I arrived at George's house, I knew what to expect. He said he had to show me something that was urgent. He had said that looking for the pesky ant hill that was nested somewhere in his rock field, he had found something. Something or some things. More than one. Well, of course, you don't even know what these things are. I'll tell you, or you will soon find out. So I took my time reaching George's house. I thought it was just a silver dollar or some petrified wood. He was always making a big deal out of nothing. George's house loomed before me like a shining beacon of darkness. I got the shivers. Why? It was just George's house. I had come here to play poker every evening with Joe, too. Joe was not told of this new finding. George has told me that Joe panics in times like these. Joe was currently at the firing range, anyway. Panics? Of what? I knocked on the door with a shivering hand. Just a silver dollar, or a fossil, or. The door flung open, revealing a very puzzled yet excited Georges. Thank God, Jim. Come, come. Georges pulled me out from the doorstep and into the comfort of his home. He led me into the kitchen, into his breakfast table. On the table were 3 stones. Ordinary-looking stones. They sported the shiny gloss of some kind of red paint. Very pearly, I might add. Wow, did my face look red. Just stones, rocks, from his rock yard. I had been trembling a few minutes ago for no reason. Look, Jim, these are very important gifts from my own yard. Look, look, Georges said, pointing at the 3 painted rocks. Georges, did you perhaps have a little too much to drink last night? I said. No, these are portals, Jim. I found them in my yard yesterday. I must have put them too close together because just look. Georges ran to the table and picked up one of the rocks, which he placed next to the middle one. Then he took the other stone from the other end of the table and set it with the others. Georges looked back at me and smiled. Then he pulled out a seat for me to take. I nervously took it and sat down beside him at the table. Now, look carefully, Georges said. Immediately after he said this, the stones started rattling and shaking. Electricity sprouted out of the stones and cracking light. Georges, what are you doing? Just hold on, Jim. We're in for a ride. Now the stones glowed and they became eyes. Big, yellow, glowing eyes until the eyes morphed together, making a bright circle of yellow light, and Georges and I were gone. Chapter 2 Land Without Time. I was out of my seat. I was up in the air. Georges was in front of me, laughing and whooping. He fell into the large circle of light. The light was becoming brighter and bigger until Georges was flung into it. His body became smaller and smaller before me. George's hair whipped behind him. His whooping was no longer audible. I grabbed onto the chair, fingers slipping away. The light engulfed me. Now I was twisting and flying around. I couldn't even hear myself scream. The light was twirling and spiraling around my flipping body. The light now turned red and then blue, baby blue, that soon turned to dark blue. My arms shook and flapped around me like running hoses. My legs were locked outward like steel poles. I closed my eyes, tears billowing away from my cheeks. The air now felt like ice, and the dark blue light was gone. Now I was falling down, and then I hit something hard. I still kept my eyes closed, though, and I could feel the tears coursing down my cheeks. This must be heaven, I thought. I died in that horrible portal. Jim, are you crying? Then I heard laughter. Come on, get up. No, you're not dead. That's what I first thought, too. I opened my eyes, squinting past the tears. There was Georges smiling down on me, dirt plastered on his face. He gave me his hand and helped me up. This is when I got to see this new world. The sky above us was orange. There was a sun, but it was green. There were also 2 moons circling around it very fast. The ground I was standing on was soiled with red weeds growing out, which had gnarly thorns that poked out of the leaves. Off in the distance was a large building that looked like a hangar. A loud humming noise emanated from it. So, how do you like it? Georges asked. What the hell is this place? I responded. This is Earth, Georges said. Well, like I say, Earth's shadowed world. This is actually a world? A planet? Not a planet. You could search space for thousands of years and you wouldn't find it. This world is only going to be found with those portal keys, Georges explained. Is there life here? I asked, looking around. Georges only smiled. Come on, we'll miss our flight. He turned and ran towards the hangar. He looked back to beckon me on. All I could do was follow him, not knowing what I was getting myself into. Chapter 3 Heaven's Demons. So I trudged through the unknown land, kicking the weeds around in the soil, which resembled purple vines. On my fall out of the portal, which had just closed up behind us, I had fallen on one of those red weeds. So an unnoticed thorn was sticking straight out of my jeans. I didn't care, though. This world was too much for me to take in all at once. The hangar loomed ahead of us. A steel antenna protruded from the rooftop, erupting with beautiful strikes of electricity. I was astounded and interested. I didn't know what to think. Dreaming kept popping into the midst of my mind. The front of the hangar was inscribed with the language, Dorft Landsky. Here comes our ride, Georgia said excitedly. I looked up, and I ended up doing a double take. A huge flying contraption came into view, which looked like a Wright brothers design. It had two long, heavy wings protruding out of it. There was also a huge propeller on the bottom and on top. Just like the hangar, the contraption had an antenna coming out of the nose. Electricity cracked from the rod. The contraption stopped abruptly, directly above the hangar, and a rope rolled out from the door on the base. Here are the shadow humans, Georgia said, pointing at the rope. Many humans slid out from the door on the rope until they were on the landing pad. One by one, they slid down until the shadow plane was empty and the pad was full. Those look like ordinary humans to me, I said. And they did. They wore suits and t-shirts, except for the women who wore sundresses or tank tops. Come on, Georgia said. Georges led me to the entrance of the hangar, and the crowd was just leaving. That's when I got a glimpse of one of the males. It didn't look human at all. It had gray-colored skin with several strands of hair covering his face. Its eyes were yellow and complete with cat-like pupils. Its upper and lower jaws jutted outwards, like an ape, showing off the lining of huge teeth through its purple lips. It had a nose, but it was only a small bump with nostrils. The shadow man looked over at me, then tipped its hat, which looked moth-eaten and even sunstroked. "What was that?" I asked, bewildered. A native. Georges pulled me away from the approaching crowd and into the open archway of the hangar. No doors? I thought. Inside the hangar was a huge dome-shaped room, marked with small booths and swarms of shadow people. Georges and I passed a couple who were kissing with snake-like tongues. A kid with a baseball cap which read, "How about them Klebold Swats?" looked up at me, then held on to his mom fearfully. A man carrying a briefcase looked at Georges and hissed warningly. A gray-skinned older man in a wheelchair looked at me with mixed expressions. Its lamp-like eyes blinked at me, dubiously. Georges and I stopped at an open booth. A young shadow woman with chestnut hair looked up at us perplexed. Her eyes even watered. "Two, please," Georges said, leaning on the front of the booth. The booth was littered with stickers saying, "Baggage is left at Area GP," and "Zleefolt isn't just a city in Bardit." While the woman was typing on something that looked like a toaster with keys, I asked Georges what Zleefolt was. "I asked that myself. That's their currency," Georges said. "These rides are free, but tipping is customary." The woman smashed a huge stamp onto two pieces of wood and handed them to Georges. Georges handed me one, which read, "Dorft Landsky, Arena 7U5, Tritus Capton, Destination." "Where are you fondlings from?" the woman asked, showing sharp yellow teeth. I shuddered at this. "You must be from Slunder. Haven't been there myself, but I heard that place is like a whole nother planet." She chuckled, which caused her long tongue to flop away from her purple lips. "Yep, home sweet Slunder," Georgia said, pushing me away. "Slunder's our home sweet home." As we turned, the lady looked at us with bared teeth. Chapter 4. The Miracle City. "We have to watch out for these people," Georgia said, guiding me through an unlit tunnel marked arena. "Some are overprotective of their race. When they see someone not like them, they might become hostile." "Hostile?" I asked, looking at an overweight man eating a pastry. "Well, I was riding on one of those Landsky when a teenager attacked me. The security officers had to pull him off." Georges approached a man behind a pulpit and handed him his wooden ticket. The man looked at them fearfully for a second and then took Georges. I did the same, and his rat-like claw scraped across my hand for a second. I shuddered again, which made the man draw back with fear. His five-fingered claw brushed back and forth through the air, indicating that it was safe to move on. Georges grabbed me by the arm and through a door, and at the end of the hallway dangled a thick piece of metal rope. It was marked with finger grooves for easy climbing. I looked up at the hovering Landsky with enthusiasm. Georges grabbed onto the rope and was already starting to climb, his legs wrapped around it. I was shoved from behind, which almost made me fall from the tunnel and onto the platform 50 feet below. "Get a move on, Askrel," said an old man with two strands of hair dangling from his freckled scalp. I immediately jumped for the rope and started my climb, that angry man following suit. He looked up at me and snarled. Then he smiled. I lost grip of the rope and soon found myself falling away. My legs, which were wrapped around the rope, slipped. I yelled out frantically, but the angry man grabbed me by the collar of my shirt as I fell, nearly choking me in the process. He lifted me up with amazing strength so that I could grab onto the rope, which I did reluctantly. "Watch out there, Askrel. You almost made a hedge smutter there," he laughed. People behind me laughed, and so did the people in the tunnel. I smiled nervously and climbed quickly up to where the worried Georges was hanging. "You okay?" he asked. "As good as I could feel right now." Right when the teenager was pulled off of me, the security officer stabbed him, Georges explained. We were sitting on two uncomfortable metal chairs lined up very closely. I was cramped up against a very disgruntled man reading a newspaper stamped on a large piece of bark. He kept shooting me very distressed looks. In order to hear Georges, I leaned in incredibly close because there was such a loud humming noise emanating from the walls of the aircraft. His blood squirted everywhere. His eyes literally poked out of his head, Georges said darkly. They scooped him up and threw him straight off the plane. "The penalty for any crime is instant death?" I asked. "Sadly, yes," Georges said, looking out of the dirt-pasted, book-sized window. We didn't speak the rest of the ride. Up ahead, the city called Dreer was coming into focus. From the window, I watched it approach thoughtfully. Georges was looking at the same thing. He still hadn't said a word. The skyscrapers tilted off the sloping hills like mirror images. It was beautiful, and I felt a longing for it. A small part of my heart felt as if I were home again. Chapter 5. Back Home. Suddenly, a huge lurch erupted across the land sky, and I jumped out of my seat. The man next to me groaned and got up, tucking away the newspaper. The land sky tilted downwards and dropped like a stone. I screamed, grasping onto my cold metal chair. Georges got up, rolling his eyes as the machine corrected itself, and stopped abruptly. I looked around as everyone came for the now open hatchway. The rope was unraveled by a blue-suited man, who would then help the other natives, with a bright smile full of yellow teeth. Georges beckoned me, and I slowly got out of my chair. I was embarrassed because the people were looking over their shoulders at me, snickering. I got up to face Georges, my face red as a tomato. "So what's in Dreer?" I asked. "Dreer is like New York City for us," Georges explained. "Everything is here." Now the crowd was gone, and Georges stepped up to the blue-suited man. The man didn't stop smiling, though, and he carefully helped Georges onto the metal rope. Now it was my turn. I remained rooted to the floor, fearful of those sharp, rough claws touching me. I started to shake with fear. My breath bated. The man's eyes bore into me, long bushy hair swinging in front of his rubber-like skin. The man's smile faded and his eyes became glassy and suspicious. "Sir?" the man said simply. He held out his pale claw. I screamed in fear and dodged away from the creature. I jumped downwards, out of the hatch, my legs wrapping around the rope, my hands burning under the friction. My heart was pounding. I couldn't help but feel like the man was climbing the rope right behind me, his knife poised to murder me like the teenager. In an instant, I was standing on the platform next to the smiling Georges. I let go of the rope and turned, ready for the slice of the blade. Nothing. The rope was quickly pulled up and the land sky was gone. I was relieved, but still did not feel safe. "Come on, Jim, there's a lot to see," Georges said, running into the tunnel, extending into the land sky hangar. I followed, feeling the cat eyes burning into the back of my head, which only made me sprint faster. We pulled ourselves out of the roaring crowd of shadow people. This land sky hangar was of the same design as the other, but only built on a crowded city corner where the creatures were running down dirt paths with 2 lanes, just like a highway. There were no cars here, so the shadow people made it to their next destination by running down these well-worn paths. Shops and very large skyscrapers lined the sides of the streets, all humming with electricity from the familiar antennas that stuck out of the rooftops. Georges explained that this was to power the lights and the toaster-like computers that were used in the land sky hangar. The city was absolutely marvelous. Kids ran from candy shops, giggling, large apple-sized chocolate-covered cherries in their claws. Banners advertising businesses hung from metal pegs. One read, "If life's got you in the gutter, use TOSPA." It showed a picture of a shadow man sticking an electrified pin up his nose. Georges saw my puzzled face and quickly explained, "In this Earth, they believe if something isn't going right, suicide is the answer." "TOSPA is a suicide device?" I asked shockingly. Georges pulled me roughly, dragging me into the sea of outgoing people. The dirt path was dusty and littered with these red weeds, so we both stepped carefully. On our way down the street, we passed a briefcase store, a bookstore, a suit manufacturer, a police station, where men dressed in black guarded a large metal gate. There was a joke shop where long metal pipes shot confetti made of wood onto the street. The shadow people laughed distractedly at the confetti and they continued onward. And the restaurant on the street corner gave off a longing fragrance. I hadn't had anything to eat, so I was starting to walk toward it. Georges grabbed me by my dusty shirt and pulled me close to him. "We can't plan on anything at this point, Jim. We're about to leave," he said. "We can only stay here an hour at a time, and it's almost up." "Oh," I said. My stomach growled, and I wondered what such a wonderful smell could be attached to. You don't want to eat here anyway, Georges explained. The executed shadow people are cooked up and served in that restaurant. I gasped. They're cannibals? I shouted. All the shadow beings looked back at the two of us, their eyes wide, their pearly teeth sharp and bared. Even the children looked angry, their black nails pointing crazily downwards, as if ready to lash out at us. A man holding a large broom and wearing stained overalls stepped forward, his left bare foot crunching down upon a red weed. He didn't even flinch as a thorn drove right into his palm. "What did you say, you barded askel?" the shadow thing asked, his yellow eyes narrowing into slits. "Cannibals? Is that it, you pitiful martyr?" I backed away, my lips quivering. Georges held his ground, though, but he looked just as horrified. I backed up into a woman who pushed me forward and hissed. Her right hand's pinky and index finger were pressed onto her left shoulder, as if warding me off. I looked back over at the janitor, who was making the same sign on his shoulder. Many of the other shadow people were starting to mimic the woman. Suddenly I was swept off my feet as someone from behind grabbed onto my shoulders and pulled. I hit the ground hard and the janitor fell on me, long serpent tongue lolling, saliva dripping onto my forehead. Georges was also pinned down by the woman, who was sniffing at George's blowing blonde hair. The janitor grabbed my chin with his gnarly fingernails, which pinched into my flesh. I screamed, my body rigid as a board. The janitor opened his mouth, which gave off a rotting smell. The teeth even seemed like they were growing longer and dangerously sharper. Then my eyes caught George's, who was glowing an orange color, then yellow, then red. The woman jumped off of him with great agility, her hands burning and bloody. So were her exposed knees. There was a sudden flash of blue light and George's was gone. The shadow creatures looked around curiously until all their eyes rested on the janitor. My sight turned red as I saw the janitor screeching out in pain. He jumped off of my glowing body, which now had turned purple. I was rocking up and down like a rocking horse. My teeth were chattering. I was slowly disappearing. My body suddenly relaxed, and a series of blue flashes engulfed me. My body was gone now, the shadow janitor's painful yells and calls of curiosity fading away. I had slipped back into the same portal again, the colors changing with each turn in the ever-winding tunnel. This trip was much shorter than the last one, and in no time at all I was thrown forward into my kitchen chair, which shattered into pieces, letting my head smack onto the linoleum floor. I slipped into unconsciousness.
3/4 from Heaven, Part 2, Chapter 6, George's Greed. I awoke to the chilling feeling of a wet cloth on my forehead. I bursted up to find Georges sitting in a chair in front of me, a dustpan full of wood pieces in his hand. He also looked furious. "What in the name of God were you thinking?" Georges screamed, laying the pan down on the table. "What? Huh?" I muttered, my head spinning. "Calling them cannibals, you idiot! We may never be able to go back," Georges yelled. He got up from his chair and helped me up. "I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking, I guess," I replied, holding my head. "That's right, you weren't," Georges snapped. "Now my whole plan may be a waste." "I'm sorry, Wait, what plan?" I asked, wiping the blood off the cuts on my cheek. "I have a plan to own that earth, and to become king," Georges said, smiling. "What? How are you going to do that?" I asked. My legs were starting to buckle, so I lifted myself up to the counter. "I think that if I make an offer to the king of the Shadow Earth, I may be able to take his place on the throne," Georges explained. "What? That's stupid," I exclaimed. "What would you give him?" "Ownership of Earth," he said, a smile creeping across his face. "What? The king has an enormous army that can take over our world in an instant. It's a lot better than the Shadow Earth, and I think the king will be most intrigued," Georges said. "What do I care what happens to this world when I'll be ruling the Shadow one?" "Why do you want the Shadow Earth?" I asked simply. "I'm sick of this world, but this other Earth is simpler." "I think you're crazy," I exclaimed. "I think you should take those stones and smash them. That world is too dangerous." "They get that way when you're ignorant and stupid, Jim," Georgia said. "So, are you with me, or are you going to stay here and be in the Shadow King's rule? My way will be a lot better." I just sat there, stunned. I didn't know what to say. Obviously, Georges was lost in his own forest of greed. He was talking crazy. The people on that world were definitely hostile. There was no way around it. I got up suddenly, just wanting to run out of George's door, but I felt lightheaded and fell forward into George's arms. I once again fell into sleep. When I did finally wake up, I would have wished I was still asleep. I woke up in George's bedroom, the blankets pulled up to my bandaged chin. I bolted up and strided out into the kitchen, where I found the 3 stones right next to the cedar jewelry box. A note was lying right next to the stones. The note read, "Jim, sorry, but I went back to the Shadow Earth to see how bad we look there. I also want to see if I can get some kind of appointment with King Jador. Joe's coming over. Once he comes, show him into the Shadow World and meet me at Dorft Landsky if I haven't already come back." George's. I put down the note and hesitated. I then put all my attention to the cedar box, which seemed to beckon me forwards, and call my name and mock me at the same time. I had a sudden burst of hunger, and I fumbled with the box. Locked. But as I shook it, I could hear something metal and solid clinking around in there. It also sounded pretty big. I put the box down, and I looked up at the stones that were evenly spaced so they wouldn't set off. I remembered George's and his evil grin and his plan to take over that world that horrifyingly mirrors ours. George's plan was for evil, and there was only one way to end this. If George's wanted to stay there, so be it. I rooted around inside George's drawers, and I found a hammer. I walked over to the painted stones and raised the tool. I wanted to end this before it all started. Chapter 7. The Pit. I brought down the hammer with all my might. Its steel head only a blur of gray. I was blinking my eyes so I didn't see it hit, but I felt the hammer strike the solid rock. The hammer then shot backwards like it had hit a shock spring instead of a stone. The hammer flew out of my hands and smashed through the kitchen window. I stood there stunned, the stone unscathed, without even a chip of paint peeled off its surface. I sat down on a chair and stared at the stones. They were evil, I had a feeling, but I was kind of glad I hadn't destroyed the stones because George's was my best friend. Maybe there was a way to talk him out of this. Then the doorbell rang and I jumped for the door. Joe stood there smiling. I smiled back at him, but it was crooked and fearful. Joe stepped inside and I closed the door. So, George's wanted to show me something like stones? Joe said. Oh yes, come on, Joe. I led Joe into the kitchen, and I pointed at the 3 stones. What is this, and what happened to your face? Joe asked, pointing to my cheek. It's a long story, and I'll tell you on the way to Dorftlandsky, I said, pulling out a chair for Joe. Joe sat down by the table, his eyes fixed on the stones. A couple of painted rocks? What's the catch? Joe asked, sweat starting to creep on his forehead. This is, I said, sitting down beside Joe. I'm not sure if I want to do this, but I pushed the 3 stones together and the portal immediately formed, and I sighed deeply, as I was sucked headfirst into the bright red light. Beside me I could hear Joe yelling my name, but that soon faded away. I turned the last corner and saw the Shadow Earth's bright orange sky. I fell out of the exit and hit the desert earth in a cloud of dust. My already dusty shirt was now dirt black and tattered. I got up just in time to dodge the falling Joe, who also disappeared in another dust cloud. Joe was thrashing around in the dirt, his eyes snapped shut, just as mine had been. He was silently calling out my name. Come on, Joe, get up, I said. Joe snapped open his eyes and he looked around with fearful wonderment. I helped him up and Joe quickly brushed off the dust, his eyes still rolling this way and that like an owl's revolving head. He also winced, and without a word, he pulled a huge red thorn out of his left shoulder. His gray t-shirt immediately started to spot red. He then looked upwards as the portal closed up like a sink drain. One last streak of lightning passed overhead before both of us were alone. What is this place? Joe asked, holding his shoulder. This is the Shadow Earth, I replied, massaging my aching back. Shadow? Joe asked. This is just like our world, only different, I said. Like, there's not as good a technology here, and the humans look a little different. How different? How did George's get these rocks? What's that building up there? Where's George's? Where the hell are we? Joe screamed hoarsely. Just follow me and I'll tell you what I still don't even believe, I said, turning toward Dorftlandsky. Joe ran after me, anticipation overrunning him. We walked on as the bright green sun set into the north. At Dorftlandsky, George's was leaning against the back entrance, his hair blown backwards, his face pasted with dirt. His shirt was sweat-stained and his shorts were tattered. When he saw us, he smiled and greeted us, wholeheartedly. So, Joe, how do you like my world? George's asked, eyeing me slightly. It's incredible. I mean, Jim explained everything, and I think this world is so surreal, Joe said excitedly. His left hand stroked his short beard. What do you mean, your world? I asked suspiciously. I crossed my arms and tilted my head towards him. I have a meeting with the king up in Losdor. It's scheduled a few days from now, George's replied, giving off another toothy grin. Yeah, Jim told me about that. Isn't that a little off the wall, George's? Joe said, and I nodded in agreement. You'll both be happy I did this in the end. I mean, our own new world. Ha! George said, grinning at me. Everyone's forgotten about our mishap, but we should stay on our toes for a while, George said to me. But I want to show Joe Dreer. You want to come? I shook my head. You two go on, I'll wait until my hour is up. Maybe see the sights, I replied. George nodded and led Joe into the entrance, Joe looking confused and excited at the same time. My smile soon turned to a frown. I sighed and slid down the wall behind me until I was relaxing on the dirt. I looked down upon my scratched watch face and even sighed deeper this time. 40 minutes until I would be back in my own bed again. I stared longingly into the orange sky that was now turning blood red as the sun disappeared among the horizon. I gasped and understood the real story about this earth. It was still Earth, like it or not, and for some reason it was just split into two pieces. Altogether it was the same, but apart each significant life form starts to change and adapt to its own environment. I sprung up. That was it. This was Earth, which at one time was connected to us, but was cut down the middle, if you will, and connected by 3 stones. I walked back into the desert, leaving dwarfed land sky behind, and the flying machine, which was now taking off from the platform, probably with Joe and George's as passengers. I gave up on my hike and collapsed into the dirt. I lay my head up against a moss-eaten rock. I rested my hands up against my chest like a corpse. A large bird, the size of my entire leg, perched near my feet. It looked similar to a crow, but it had a red beak. Only the red was dripping off its beak, and I realized the red was blood. I jumped back up, making the large crow take off in a swirl of wind. I turned around in a swift movement to see a large pit dug into the ground. A whole army of crows swarmed around the pit like vultures. My heart froze, and I felt that if I took the next few steps to look inside, my life would change drastically. I was certainly right. Yet I approached it anyway, and I screamed. The birds flew off, blowing back my rag shirt and dirty hair. The pit was filled to the brim with dead shadow people, all slaughtered and bloody. There was also something moving in the crowd of corpses. A living person crouched nearby, a dead woman, gnawing on her purple, lifeless arm. The cannibal looked up at me and snarled, blood dripping from his chin, his yellow teeth deadly and pin-sharp. I turned and ran, the shadow man pouncing after me. With long, heavy strides, I screeched again, my feet shuffling along. My toe caught on a rock, and in an instant my sneakers were pointed into the now purple sky. My back struck the earth and stars exploded across my vision. The last thing I remembered was the shadow thing's cold, slippery claws wrapping around my neck. I sprang out of my bed and hit the floor with a hard bounce. Yes, it was my bed. It was 1:42 in the morning, and I had just been sleeping. A dream. It was all a nightmare. I laughed nervously, and I massaged my forehead, but my hands were running across cloth. I jumped up to my bruised feet, and I ran into my bathroom. In the mirror, my face was covered in blood-soaked bandages, and so was my exposed chest. My left leg was wrapped tightly with an ace bandage, and there was no ignoring the band-aids on my chin and cheek. "No!" I screamed, springing away from my mirror. I ran from the bathroom and swung my robe over my shoulders. I went out of my apartment door and continued out of the building. George's only lived 2 blocks away in his grandmother's old house. When I had reached George's house, I found all the lights on. I rang the doorbell, and almost immediately George's answered the door, pale, rugged, and half awake. "Jim, thank God. I was so worried." "Georges, I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that world is dangerous. Do you really want to be the king of those monsters? I mean, look at my face," I said, coming into his living room. "I was going to ask you what happened. Once my hour was up, I had Joe touch my shoulder as I disappeared, so he'd come with me," Georges explained. "Since you still had 15 minutes until you get back home, I sent Joe home and I watched some TV for the rest of the time. I heard a crash, so I knew you would come back, and then I saw you bloody, torn apart, muttering under your breath. You were still alive, so I carried you to your house and hoped to God you weren't in traumatic health. I bandaged you up, gave you some medicine, and then I would check on you in the morning," Georges ended. "Well, this is what happened, George," I said. I explained my story, and throughout the entire thing, Georges listened intently. Yet it would take more than that to break him. Chapter 8. Law's Door. When I had finished, Georges just nodded and slowly stood up. He made his way over to the fridge and took out 2 beers. He placed one in front of me and sat down. "Well," I said, "I've looked up this world's history in a library down in Dreer, and what you found, Jim, is a complos." Georges replied, taking a sip of his beer. "What the hell is a complos?" I asked. "When people are executed, their bodies are put in a complos until they are packaged up for a restaurant," Georges said. "The cannibal you saw was only a bum who was just trying to get a free meal." "So that man wanted to eat me?" I asked, unbelievingly. Only a few hours ago I had just been starting to accept that side of the earth for what it was. I was even starting to wonder if something that evil could have come from my earth. "No, he was just afraid of going to jail, so he was just trying to, kill you," Georges muttered. "They have a strict thing about only eating their own kind hours after they've been dead." "Oh, great. Georges, can't you see all he was trying to kill me?" I yelled. "Jim, we have people killing each other over here too, do we not?" Georges snapped. "We have evil, murders, and bloodshed, just like the Shadow Earth." I sat back, laying my palm across my stinging head. Everything was happening so fast. My head was spinning. I could feel every stinging cut, thumping bruise, and pulled muscle in my back. I was in so much pain, and it hadn't even started yet. Georges sighed and sipped his beer again. He set the beer down slowly and looked intently up at my sculpted face. He looked away again and finished off the can. "Look, Jim, I know this could be dangerous, but in 2 days we're meeting King Jabad, and I'm not going to back out now," Georges said. I can't argue with you, George, because obviously it's not working, but just hear me out, I began. Think about this. Destroy those stones. Please, won't you just sleep on it? I asked. I will, Jimbo, but you look more tired than I am, so why don't we both sleep on it? He said, pointing to the couch. Georgia said good night and went off to bed. I took my unopened beer to the couch and chugged it in just 30 seconds. I belched and collapsed into the couch. Oh God, what next? I woke up to the smell of bacon and my stomach growled hungrily. I got up and made my way to the kitchen, where the yawning Georges was hovering over a frying pan. Hello, Jim, nice night, Georges asked, dripping some soggy eggs onto a paper plate. All right for a couch, I'm starved, I replied. Here, Georges said, handing me the plate. And Jim, do you know what happened to my kitchen window? No, I said, scarfing down the eggs and bacon. Georges fixed himself a plate and brought over 2 mugs of coffee. He gave me one and drank deeply from his own. Take those bandages off after breakfast and I'll put some liquid Band-Aid on it. Georges bit off a piece of bacon. Let's hope nothing's infected. I sipped from my coffee and looked up at him. So, Georges, what have you decided? I asked. Georges didn't answer at first, but he didn't even look up from his plate. He took a bite of egg and then slowly looked into my worried eyes. You know, I can't let this opportunity go. I'm sorry, Jim. I'm drunk on my own sense of power, Georges replied, taking another swig of black coffee. I sighed and did the same. Okay, Georges, but I'm hesitant on this whole plan. I'll have to pass, I said. I got up from my chair to leave. No, Jim, I need you, Georges said. He sprang up and caught me around the arm. Joe is all for the idea, but he's not my right-hand man. I can't rely on him. Without you, my plan is crap. I stopped and looked over at him. His eyes were pleading and his grasp was persistent. Let me think more about it, okay? I'll let you know tonight, I said. Georges beamed at me. Before I left, he pulled off my bloody bandages and sprayed me up with the liquid protection. He gave me another strip of bacon and I was on my way. I went home, took a shower, and put on some nice clothes. I thought I'd go visit my girlfriend Amy. At the time, she was going to move in with me at the end of the week, so she was probably still packing. I hopped into my car and drove down 3 miles to Amy's apartment building. Outside, she was lifting a large stereo onto a pickup with a friend behind the wheel. I pulled up and she waved to me. I came out of the car and she kissed me on the lips smoothly. She hugged me and waved goodbye to her friend. Where have you been? I've left like 100 messages, Amy said. Amy was a beautiful woman. She had chestnut brown hair and a well-sculpted face. She also had green eyes you could get lost in. Suddenly, Amy looked curiously up at me and took off her heavily tinted sunglasses so I could see her lovely eyes. She gasped and wrapped her hands around the sides of my face. I winced slightly. What happened to your face? Amy yelled, kissing my bruised cheek. I thought desperately. I definitely couldn't tell her my horrific secret. Georges didn't even have to tell me not to. It was too dangerous and I would look insane. So I came up with the next best thing. Oh, this? I was bike riding up in Red Rocks and I took a little spill down a rocky slope. I lied. But it sounded truly nonfiction. Oh my God, and you didn't call me? When did this happen? Amy asked worriedly. Oh, yesterday. I didn't call because it was really nothing, I said shakily. Well, I would call it something. Call me next time, she said, and she kissed me again. Come on in. You can help me move. Well, I had turned off that ticking time bomb, and then I was off with Amy. But there would be a lot more mines to mark my ever-winding road. I was upstairs helping Amy lift up a very heavy table when the cell phone on the table rang ear-splittingly. I screamed, startled. I almost dropped the table right onto Amy. I slowly set down the large piece of wood and picked up the chiming phone. Hello? I said, clearly into my phone. Jim, what the hell are you doing? Georges said through the receiver. What are you talking about? I asked dumbly. It's nearly 4 o'clock. You said you were going to tell me what your plan is by then, Georges said in a whispered hush. Oh yeah, I've been helping Amy move all afternoon. I guess I lost track of... I don't care. What's your decision? Georges snapped. Georges, I don't know. I need more time, I replied. You don't have time. We meet the king tomorrow, he yelled. Even Amy heard this, and she looked up in interest. I turned my back on her and whispered shakily into the phone. Fine, Georges, but if this plan of yours fails, we let it go. Don't press on about it, I said. Yes, of course. Oh, thank God you're on my team, Georges said excitedly. Now come over. You're sleeping here tonight. We must meet the king early in the morning, Georges added. I said goodbye and hung up the phone. Sorry, Amy, I have to go to George's house pronto, I rambled, creeping around the table. Why, is tonight poker night? She asked in a calm manner. Yes, I'm late too. I strided for the stairs. I'll help you finish moving tomorrow, I promise. Then I was out her door. I got into my car and drove away, leaving a confused Amy standing in the hall, which was blockaded by a large oak coffee table. I drove slowly down the vacant street. For a second, it even looked like that cracked, well-worn concrete had morphed into that dirt pathway from the other world. Shadow people were running by in quick gray flashes. Each time they ran by, they'd hiss through the window, long tongues licking at the glass. Even the red weeds were prying themselves out of the dirt highway like the living undead. I shivered, my eyes rolling this way and that at the hideous creatures. Then George's dropped out of the sky, bloody and tattered. He smacked into the windshield, and I screamed, my hands twirling my steering wheel like a shipman dodging large crashing waves. George's lips smiled, and his white blank eye winked. I closed my eyes and yelled wildly. Then my car smacked hard into something. It came to a halt, and I was swung forwards. I caught myself and opened one eye. I had hit a mailbox. That was it. And what was so creepy about it was that it was George's mailbox. I had just driven right to George's house with my eyes closed. I backed up and drove into his driveway. I got out and rang the bell. George's opened the door, beaming, and pulled me inside. Oh boy, was I in for a treat. When I got inside, Joe was scarfing down a microwave pizza. He looked up at me and smiled. A thin drop of pizza sauce dripped from his muzzle. Hey, Jimbo, ready for our adventure? Joe said. Oh, I heard about your fiasco, so let's stay away from the comploses. The 3 stones were there on the table again, and so was the cedar box. The one which felt like it was mocking me, the one I was itching to learn more about. I sat down at the table and smiled friendly-like to Joe. George came in and looked at me curiously. Jimbo, do you know what happened to my mailbox? He asked. I woke up to Joe's snores. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was stuck on the couch with Joe. I rolled over onto my side and tried to get to sleep again. Then the sound of soft footfalls proceeding into the kitchen caused me to snap open my eyes. Then I heard the flick of a switch, and the kitchen was suddenly illuminated. I rose my head and peeked over the top of the couch so I could get a view of the kitchen. Georges stood there by the kitchen table, a key resting in the palm of his hand. He was looking down at it thoughtfully before he quickly shoved it into the keyhole of the box. He clicked it open and slowly rose that wooden lid. I craned my neck to see over his shoulder, but Georges quickly pulled whatever it was out of the box and pocketed it into his jeans. He was already dressed, and his hair was still wet from the shower. Georges turned, and I ducked back down into my blankets. The kitchen light flicked out. Georges walked into the family room where Joe and I slept, and he stopped directly in front of the couch. I could feel his steel gaze boring down. Wake up, you two, it's time, Georges said, and Joe burst out of his slumber. I slowly rose and rubbed my eyes to disguise the fact that I had been awake. Get dressed, we leave in 10. Then my life changed forever. We were in the shadow world on a land sky due west, towards Losdor. The world was not in complete darkness, but the sky was purple, and there was a moon, but it was the shape of a triangle. It also had a white hue around it. The ride to Losdor was about 20 minutes long. Us 3 were the only people aboard, too. Obviously, the shadow people were not night people. Georgia said they all had a curfew for bedtime. It was 10 o'clock each night. I believe I had fallen asleep because by the time Joe woke me up, we were at the pillaring castle of Losdor. The castle looked like one of those baby building block towers stacked in descending order. I marveled at the stone castle, which had one big stained glass window on each block of the building. A beautiful crystal lake separated the land sky airport from the castle's main entrance. On the subsequent landscape of the rolling green fields, large hawk-like birds circled around in blurry ovals. Once in a while they'd screech ear-splittingly. Georges pointed north, where high-tipped mountains guarded the Losdor castle from behind. Snow capped these mountains, which caused me to reflect on the beautiful, majestic Rocky Mountains. As the land sky began its descent, I got to see a large courtyard sitting atop the hill in front of the beautiful castle. Large stone statues lined the edges of the courtyard. I couldn't make them out because the land sky turned to the side, and it came to a complete stop. The hatchway was opened and the rope unraveled. The blue-suited man beckoned us out of our seats. It was a different man this time, but he looked just as nice. I was used to these people by now, and I let him help me down from the land sky. Once I planted my feet on the platform below, all 3 of us stared gapingly at the castle, which was separated from us by a beautiful golden lake. This view was truly marvelous, but behind those stone castle doors was great evil. Chapter 9. The Derringer. The 3 of us made our way out of the land sky port and out towards the beach of the lake. We strode across the clean sand until we came to a wooden picket sign that read, Derringer Lake, Danger. What does it mean by danger? Joe asked, running his fingers across the splintered sign. I don't know, but there's an old boat up there, Georgia said, pointing to the shore. An even more splintered, moss-eaten boat was tied to a metal peg. A pair of oars were stacked inside. Well, looks like that's all right, I said, stepping into the boat. The others followed, but Joe was hesitant. Are you sure this boat is safe? Joe asked, his foot patting down on the base of the boat to check if it was sturdy. Only one way to find out, Georgia said. He untied the miniature boat from the peg. I picked up an oar, and so did Georges. We both pushed off from the bank and started to paddle out into the calm water. From the lake, I noticed how far the castle looked from where we were. It was quite big around, which meant it would have taken days to reach the castle if we were on foot. The green sun was just starting to creep out of the corner of the black, steeping mountains. The triangular moon was also starting to disappear behind the land-sky hangar. I took a deep breath and marveled at the beauty of this new world. It was truly a radiant dwelling, despite the creature that nestled there. The mysterious gray mountainside, violet glowing night skies, majestic rolling hills, and the calm rarity of the almost mirror-like lake were breathtaking. Then the lovely drifting silence was torn into shreds by a long blur of greenish yellow slicing out of the water like the swing of a knife. The blur struck forward, smashing Joe right across his upper face. He fell backwards, half his flailing body hanging over the side of the rowboat, and the blur halted above our heads, and we saw it was a long, slippery tentacle, around 80 feet tall. It collapsed back into the lake with a spray of water. We both sprang forwards and helped Joe back into the boat. He was wailing in pain, and for good reason. His eye was black, and his nose was gushing blood. A large bruise was already starting to form on his cheekbone. "What the hell was that?" I asked, tipping back Joe's head. "I don't know," Georgia said, looking out toward the lake. Joe suddenly went quiet and spit out a loogie of blood. A tooth was also in the saliva. He looked up at me fearfully, one eye literally smaller than the other. "Georges, pick up the oar. We're rowing back," I said. Georges looked back at where we had come and shook his head fearfully. "No, we've already gone at least halfway. Let's just finish it." "George, no, it's too dangerous," I yelled, pointing at the semi-conscious Joe. But Georges had already made up his mind and started to paddle forwards. All I could do was follow suit. We both were paddling hard, so the boat was moving on at an alarming speed. I actually started to think we'd make it. Wrong. The tentacle shot out of the lake and smashed into the water in front of our boat. A large wave swept across the three of us, and we all fell to the back, soaking. Another tentacle shot up, then another, until the boat was surrounded in a cage of flapping tentacles. Then the water in front of us parted and a large bulge erupted from the lake. It was a head with red eyes full of malice. A gaping mouth came into view, with rows and rows of pearly teeth. It looked similar to an octopus, only its head was misshapen, and strings of black hair fell across its scalp. The thing moaned at us and seemed to smile. The head rose, and we could see its 50-foot-tall, muscular body towering above our boat. There were 12 tentacles on each side of his body, giving it a total of 24. I yelled out as one slimy tentacle shot past my cowering head and wrapped around Joe's exposed neck. With one gut-wrenching tug, Joe was up in the air. His hands clawed at the tentacle and his feet kicked at the empty space. Then the tentacle recoiled and the flailing Joe was underwater. And the creature was too, gone in another large wave which swept me head over heels. Georges darted to the side of the boat and I did too. Joe's screaming, dying face cried up at us as he was dragged deeper downward. Georges gave me a scared, hopeless look, then dove down into the lake. "No!" I screamed, my hand reaching out to his fading legs. I fell back into the boat, tears coursing down my face, shivering arms wrapped around my shoulders. My two friends had to be dead. There was no way that creature hadn't already ripped them apart. Now I was next. Well, if I was going to die, why not now? I was just about to dive down when I heard a large bang and the screech of the creature. The lake immediately started to turn red. The tentacles were even starting to float to the surface. Then George's head popped out of the water, and so did Joe's unconscious one. I helped Joe up and then George's. "How'd you kill that thing?" I asked. "With one of the paddles," Georges said, throwing back his wet hair. "Stuck it in the eye." I looked to the corner of the boat and saw only one paddle was there, but that tale sure didn't sound logical. I thought I had seen that paddle wash away when the wave hit us. I also had heard a loud bang, like a garbage can hitting a brick wall. What was Georges hiding? Chapter 10. The King. We dragged Joe onto the beach and we both collapsed onto the sand. It was 20 minutes later and we were dead tired. I was soaked and now sand was sticking to my clothes. My face was sunburned and my lips were chapped. I would have slept there all day, but Georges dragged me to my feet and splashed water on Joe's face. Joe slowly woke up and Georges helped him up too. I looked up and saw the castle looming ahead of us in a thin stream of fog. All that separated us from the king was the courtyard, which housed all of the stone statues. Georges and Joe walked up the small staircase that led to the courtyard. I ran up next to the shivering Joe, and I patted his shoulder. He looked over at me with a dazed expression. He smiled forcefully and looked forward again. The courtyard was truly wondrous. We saw statue after statue, several on each side of a neatly kept gravel path. The path would finally lead up to the steel gates of Lawsdor Castle. Each statue was of a past king of this world, and some depicted great wars or battles. One statue had a shadow creature stabbing a great walking and talking mountain. The mountain had red slits for eyes and a cave-like mouth with stalactites and stalagmites for teeth. I caught up with the others, who were all the way up to the gate. They were both staring at a lone sculpture close to the wrought iron bars. When I got up to the statue, I understood. The sculpture was of a shadow person in long blowing robes. Well, half of the shadow person, anyway. One half of the man's face was sculpted just like a human's. A human nose, an ordinary eye, not yellow, and a human cheekbone. This wasn't what stunned me, though. The statue's arm was frozen outwards. His hand was the same, too. One half had the long nails and the pale rough skin. On the other side of the hand were my regular fingers and nails. In the hand was the earth, but it was split down the middle. It was separated, and the two halves were connected by a colorless rainbow. One half was cracked and black, the other plentiful and healthy. Is that supposed to be our earth? I asked, looking at the destroyed half. Could that rainbow be the stones? I don't know. Let's hurry, though, Georges said, checking his watch. We only have 10 minutes until we go back. Joe and Georges approached the black gate. I gave one last look to the statue and then followed. Somehow the shadow people knew about our Earth. Was that possible? Georges pushed a wooden button on the gate and it swung inward. We all gave each other one excited look before continuing onwards up to the oak wooden doors of the castle. Right as we approached the doors, they creaked open and a well-armored shadow man stepped forward, a wooden spear held at his chest. You're the 11 o'clock appointment, are you not? The man growled, eyeing me suspiciously. We are, Georges said, stepping forward. Come, the man said, and he led us into the heart of the mansion. It was magnificent. Glass chandeliers and wide paintings of past kings decorated the walls and ceilings. The guard took us through many different passages and rooms. There was a gallery full of miniature statues and glass sculptures. There was a floor-to-ceiling fireplace which had a roaring fire. We passed by a room with cages full of wondrous creatures I wanted to learn more about. There was a room completely dedicated to a huge bookcase covering all the walls. A hallway had many different foreign instruments and masks decorating the walls. One mask looked exactly like a human face, and once again I shuddered. We walked up cascading stairwells and slid across overly polished marble floors. We tiptoed across a room with grass and wild weeds growing out of the floor. One giant weed hissed at me and then split in half. Then a new one grew in its place. We walked for what seemed like hours until the guard led us to a brightly orange ceiling-length door. The king will see you now, the guard said, and he opened the door by just touching it. We only had 5 minutes left, so we quickly got inside. We all expected a large arena-sized room, like the other ones, but this one wasn't much bigger than my bedroom. The walls were blank and so were the ceilings. All there was a paled old shadow man sitting on an oversized throne. He wore a dazzling jeweled crown, and he wore a silk robe. Wrinkles wore down his face, and somber eyes looked up at us. Georges stepped up to his throne and pulled out a folded wad of soaked pictures. He held them up to the king and kneeled in front of him. The king's grotesque greenish hand took the pictures and curiously looked at them. I could see his black iris shrink into focus and his curling black nails raking across the photos. Please, your majesty, I would like to make a proposition, Georges said. He licked his lips nervously and gave me a soft glance. What is this place depicted on these shiny parchments? The king asked. And just when Georges was about to answer, the king focused on us. Please, I only see one person at a time. Georges looked back at Joe and I and gave us a pleading look. We both stepped outside the open door, and it slammed behind us. Inside we could hear George's muffled voice and the king's soulful one. Joe gave me a worried look and I returned it. Then his nose began to bleed and he started to get dizzy. I helped him to the floor and I tilted back his head. The guard looked down on us and growled. His yellow eyes pulled back into slits. He brandished his spear. Don't you two look different? You kinda look like that statue outside. When I look at you, I see trouble. I shook my head fearfully and dragged Joe to his feet. We both turned the corner, the guard starting after us. Once we had gotten away from the guard, we sprinted down the hall, Joe at my heels. Once I looked back to help Joe, I saw the guard standing at the end of the hall, spear outwards, eyes aimed straight at us. He started his pursuit. Chapter 11. The Dungeon. Joe and I fled down the hall. We sprinted into a room which was empty except for a staircase leading downwards. We jumped down the stairs, our heads spinning. Once we were down at the bottom, we sprinted into another room. I shut the door behind Joe and locked it without fumbling. I led Joe across the room, which looked like a garage for cars. It was also empty. At the end of the concrete room was a hatchway in the floor. I opened the door and let Joe slip down into it. I heard Joe scream as he dropped through what sounded like 100 feet, down into the chasm below. I heard a loud crunch and then silence. Joey! I screamed, but there was no answer. Then the room's doorknob turned and the door clanked back and forth. Then I heard snarling and the clicking of metal. It sounded like keys. Open the door, Askrals. I have a key, and if I have to use it, there's no stopping me from slicing you open, the creature screamed. There was a long pause, and then the sound of metal sliding into the keyhole. I looked one last time into the black pit, which seemed to go downward into eternity. I took a deep breath and slid into this dark pit. The trapdoor snapped shut behind me, and I could faintly hear the room's heavy wood door bang open. I screamed out and could hear my own voice swirling around me, bouncing off the dry dirt-caked wall. That was all I remembered. I didn't even remember hitting the ground below. Once again, I fell unconscious, but it was more like falling into sleep. Joe shook me awake, his clammy, ice-cold fingers patting my flushed cheeks. I got up to my aching feet and looked around the dungeon. And yes, it was a dungeon. Rusted, bloody chains hung from the ceilings, and there was many severed heads on the soaking floor. Also, there was faint chewed and gnawed meat scattering this way and that. I knew this was not a jail. My thoughts were confirmed when a skeletal creature with tight blue skin bounded out of the darkness. Rows of jagged teeth protruded from its oversized lip. 2 beady green eyes stared down at us. Then the creature leapt from its long bony haunches. Its 4-fingered hand clawed through the air and caught us both by the chests. We struck the muddy wall. The creature screeched like a banshee. Then it sprang at us again, its claws coming downwards, jaw opening alarmingly wide. The thing's fat, short tongue lolled out. Blood and saliva spun out of its open mouth. The eyes extended 3 times their size, revealing large brown pupils. Then my eyes tinted red, then orange, then blue. The left arm of the thing caught around my neck and squeezed. The face of the creature came within a breath's length. It smiled at me and was about to bite into my purple face before I disappeared into the portal. I was whisked away from that creature. Then I saw the long, bony thing spinning after me, Joe clasped tight to its chest. He looked dazed and distant. Blood was trickling out of his ears and nose. The thing smiled at me before all 3 of us were spit out of the portal and into George's kitchen.
3 Quarters from Heaven, Part 3, Chapter 12, Ready for a New Life. The creature pounced on me and made tatters of my shirt in one smooth thrust of his hand. I catapulted into the kitchen counter, making the toaster and the blender compact. Joe was flung through the kitchen doorway and out into the living room. The thing jumped up onto the counter with great agility and picked me up clumsily by the neck. I was soon face to face with the creature, its stench-ridden breath looming over me like a dark cloud. My shaking hand patted at the counter, searching for anything at all. The creature's lips pulled apart, revealing its diseased, dank mouth. The tongue lolled out at me, blood dripping off. My hand caught a knife, which must have been dislodged when I crushed the kitchen knife block. I slashed it upward in a fast-paced blur, which ended in a spray of red blood. The creature screeched as its entire head fell back from the neck. I was released as it collapsed off the counter and onto the hardwood floor. I fell back against the cabinet behind me, breathing hard, knife held to my side. Then, just as I was about to check on Joe, Georges toppled out of the now closing portal. His hour was up as well. He was smiling when he looked up at me, and then frowned when he actually saw my sorry state and the dead beast lying at my feet. "What the hell?" Georges muttered, drawing back from the corpse. I tried to answer, but my chest ached too much from the blow I had received. Joe fumbled out of the living room, mud and blood pasted to his grizzled face and tattered attire. He collapsed in George's arms, his body going limp. Georges set him into a chair, and he looked shockingly up at me. His eyes ran up and down my beaten body, from my muddy jeans to my bare chest to my cut and bruised face. "What? Where did this come from?" Georges stepped over the thing's severed head. "Give me some ice," I said. I had explained the story to Georges as Joe and him sat at the table. Joe had tissue under his nose and an ice pack to his temple. I had an ice pack on my own head, a towel thrown over my shoulders. We had both washed off our muddy clothes so that Joe and I could put on George's clean clothes. "Good Lord," Georges replied, extracting a mop from the closet. He started to mop up the blood around the now stinking body. "At the library, it never said there was an execution chamber in the Law's Door Castle. I thought it was just for the police station." "No," I snapped. "This was a home for that monster. This must be some kind of secret chamber the king uses to get rid of useless beings." "Murder? There must be a logical explanation." "So, how did your meeting go anyway?" Joe asked, breaking the silence. Georgia smiled again and sat down next to me at the kitchen table. "Oh, I showed him the pictures of our world, mostly postcards of France, New York City, Hawaii, you know," he explained. He was completely interested. I showed him samples of our technology like a calculator and a digital camera for your pocket. Anyway, he thought we could switch positions on our thrones because he seemed to love Earth and... Wait a minute. He thinks you're the king of our world? I asked. Well, yeah. How else would we agree on switching positions unless someone who actually owned the place made the offer, Georges said. But what happens when he gets to Earth and finds you weren't the owner? He'll be furious, I explained. He'll come back to you and kill us. Not if we have the stones, Georges said. There'll be no portal for him to come back in. But the stones are here, I said tiredly. How are we going to bring the stones to the Shadow Earth with us? Exactly, Georges cried. When you first get sucked into the portal, up above your head you can see the 3 stones faintly glowing behind the strong ceiling of the portal. If we could somehow grab onto them, we could bring them back with us to our new world, Georges finished. I shuddered at the thought of our world. That world was truly evil and dangerous. Why couldn't he see this? I knew Joe did because he was shuddering too, his nose tissue starting to turn red again. I know I'm tricking the king into this, but once we're ruling our own world, it will be well worth it, Georges assured us. Georges, don't you see how dangerous this is? How do you know those shadow humans won't do what I've observed so far? I asked, and Joe nodded in agreement. Don't you see, guys? If we're kings, they'll have to obey and respect us, Georges said with enthusiasm. I've read that even if the king isn't liked, he still should be obeyed. Once the king signs us over, I considered, and a part of me thought this plan was actually going to work. Sure, the king would be lost in a world that could crush him like a bug, but at least we'd get something out of it. But could I actually give up my home and my family for this new world? But being king would make these horrible creatures bow down before me. I'd get used to it, and in the end, it would be better than my position here. Oh, what the hell, Joe blurted out. Jim, let's do this. But Georges, there's one thing you haven't thought about, I added. Sure, they can't come back with the stones, but they'll come back after their hour's up. Oh, but I did think of that, and I'll destroy the stones, Georges said. But I've already tried to do that with a hammer. How? Georges and Joe looked over at me bewildered. I stopped and gave an awkward smile. We'll use my sledgehammer then, Georges interrupted, giving me a suspicious glance. After that, we're stuck there for good, so you can't turn back. Are you two in? Georges gave me a pleading stare, but inside his eyes were something else. It was madness, sheer insanity. Inside Georges, he was truly going crazy over this world. I nodded just so that he would unlock his gaze. Joe did as well. So, anyway, the king is interested. He wants us to come back tomorrow with the stones so we can check out our place, okay? Georges asked. Joe nodded, his eyes wide, the shiner under his eyes twitching unnoticed. I did not nod. I just stared at the fresh blood on the kitchen floor. The blue creature's severed head was perched at my sneakers, its green blank eyes fixed on me. Well, if we're moving, I'd better get my fiancée, I said. Joe had already left to pack. I left George's house with my hands full of a trash bag containing pieces of the skeletal creature. I dumped the bag into George's trash can, burying it under all the beer cans. I hopped into my car, and as I pulled out, I looked back over my shoulder. Georges was looking out at me from his attic window, his eyes alight. He had a deep, longing frown painted on his chin. There were black, wrinkled bags hanging from his chilled eyes. He quickly stepped back so he was out of view. Yet I could still feel his icy stare as if he was peeking over the windowsill. I sped away, my former knowledge of Georges gone with the wind. He was insane with power. Could I trust Georges anymore? I knew Joe detected this in our friend as well. He was just as uneasy as I was during lunch. I sped back to Amy's apartment building where she was just getting into her Volkswagen Beetle. She had her beautiful shining hair pulled back. Her cheekbones were rosy and thick with makeup. She was wearing a small halter top and dark jeans. She looked up at my beaten-down Toyota rambling toward the curb. She smiled and slid out of the car majestically. I stumbled out of mine, with my head still bandaged and an uncomfortably tight shirt pasted to my thick chest. Fresh blood was also starting to collect on my slowly healing face. Amy's face turned to shock as she jumped into my arms. What happened to you? Amy, I just bumped into something. Why I'm here, though, is... I didn't know how she was about to take this news. How we couldn't get married in front of her families and friends. How we'd be one of the 3 new rulers of an almost misunderstood world. Could she accept this? I still didn't believe what was happening to me. How would she react? I shuddered unmistakably, making Amy draw back, her full pink lips pursed, her chest heaving as she took a deep, lumbering breath. Amy, how would you like to get married someplace else? Someplace wonderful and beyond your wildest dreams? I was sugarcoating it a bit, putting a pleasant mask on a savage monster. Instead, Amy kissed me long and hard, her hips swinging against mine, fingertips scratching across my bruised cheeks. She then looked up at me, her lips parting in pure love. Jim, you're taking me someplace exotic? The Bahamas? Hawaii? We're not going to get married in the church then? Oh, will our families come? Jim, I interrupted her, my fingers pressed upon her pursed lips. I looked down into her eyes, my mouth searching for the right words. Why didn't I just leave her there? The departure would be overwhelming, but at least Amy would be safe. Amy, that suitcase in your car, is that all your bare necessities? Yes, she said, bemused. Take it. We're going to leave today. I'll explain everything soon, I said, jumping into my already running car. Amy just stood there, stunned for a few seconds, her arms folded over her chest. She disappeared into her own car and tinkered around a bit. She came out with her suitcase, her hips swinging with each clumsy step. She threw her suitcase into the back of my Toyota and looked intently into my flushed, beaten face. I could feel Amy's eyes scanning my head. I locked the doors, sealing her fate. I swerved away from Amy's home, knowing she would never see it again. I was leaving everything behind I ever loved. I had a job as a mechanic, and I was a damn good one at that. I had the weekend off, but I had so far missed 2 days of work due to my sudden interest in this horrific, beautiful world. My boss, Andy Lowell, must have tried to call my place many times, but I had hardly been home. You want to tell me what the hell's going on? Amy asked. All will be explained, honey. But for now, don't ask too many questions. It will all go right over your head. Jim, what do you mean? I don't understand any of this. Amy's lip began to quiver. I lost track of time for a moment and snapped out of my daze when I heard Amy scream. I swerved until I smashed into something unmovable. Amy was screaming and clawing on me, and I realized that I had crashed into a garage door. Last time I had blacked out and imagined the shadow world, I had ended up hitting George's mailbox. Now I had blacked out and crashed into his garage door. It was almost as if the car had driven itself here when I couldn't see the road any longer. Almost as if the stones were drawing me to them. Once that world had gotten a taste of me, it kept going back for more. More or less, I believe that. Amy looked over at me and kissed me on my head. Jim, oh God, are you okay? I don't know, I just spaced out, yet it was more than that. I tore away from my fiancée's embrace and fumbled out of my car. I vomited onto the pavement, feeling as if I had just taken a bath in hot oil. Amy threw her arms around me from behind, her hot face pressed into the small of my back. Then, as I spit the leftovers of my sickness into the sidewalk, I realized, just like George's, that I was going insane. Amy and I knocked on George's door, and surprisingly, Joe answered, sweaty and just as disarrayed as I was. He pulled us inside and quickly led us into the kitchen. Joe sat down at the usual spot at the kitchen table, and I took a seat too, stretching out my back. Amy shakily said hi to Joe, but dismissed herself into the bathroom. I had an inkling to go after her, but the 3 stones on the table twinkled at me and urged me to stay. The box sat there too, silent. Did you tell her? Joe asked me, folding his arms across the table. About our new life? Not yet, but where's George's? And why are you here? I asked quickly. George's left a note saying he went back to the shadow world. He can't be apart from that place, Joe explained, wiping his brow. The note was on the door, saying you or me could just come in. So, we leave tomorrow then, huh? I said slowly. Joe was feeling the full extent of it too. What do you think of all this? I don't know. Jim, it's all so crazy. Today I woke up and imagined big spearheads sticking out of my stomach. I imagined things too. Didn't you hear me just drive into the garage? I asked. No, I guess I must have blacked out again. These moments of lost time come so frequently, I don't even remember them anymore, Joe explained, massaging his temples, his eyes flicking back and forth to the stones. I have such a longing for those stones. All I want to do is go back to that world and die there. I was getting that feeling too, hot and burning in my chest. The stones seemed to suck me towards them, their paint gleaming and shining. I loved them, even though I had only hated them moments ago. I had visions of embracing their hot white electricity, overwhelming my twisting and burning body. I shook that away just as Joe left the kitchen. Amy came in soon after that, refreshed and looking lovely as usual. She sat down where Joe had once sat and leaned over my way. Her eyes blazed like headlights again, juicy lips pursed in a loving fashion. She had her hair let down now, the way I liked it, her mascara completely rubbed off. So, tell me, Jim, what in God's green earth is going on here? Her hands taking mine. I pulled away from Amy, my face twisted. I just couldn't be around her. It was just so painful to look at her. Just when I was about to reply to Amy, Joe bounded into the kitchen yelling like a savage ape. There was a huge sledgehammer at his side. His eyes were ablaze. Sweat poured off of his chin. I screamed and pounced onto Amy, bringing her to the floor. Joe brought the sledgehammer down onto the table. The stones scattered to each corner of the kitchen. The table split into two, the legs and chunks of chipped wood spinning out of the wreckage. Yet the sledgehammer kept on going, and it smashed a good-sized divot into the floor. Joe saw what he had done and fell to his knees, sobbing. I rolled off of the stunned Amy and pulled Joe to his feet. He looked up at me with glassy, respectful eyes, but behind that gaze was a look of pure hatred and loathing. He was truly not in the right state of mind for this, and neither was I. I hugged him and let him cry into my shoulder. I patted his back and ruffled up his hair, as we used to do as kids. I also gasped at the sight of the now open box, its lid splintered open by the force of the weapon. It lay there scattered at my feet. Once I saw the once hidden objects that Georges had no intention of showing us, I drew in a deep, lung-burning breath, which caused Joe to look at me. I screamed, Joe and Amy jumping high in the air. My eyes rolled back, and I drew short of breath, as Joe too began to scream. Then, until the portal was quickly formed, Georges was home. Chapter 13. George's Change. In George's cedar box was a handgun. 5 bullets were scattered around it. There was also a gobbet of meat inside a Ziploc bag. Another bag was there at my feet, only inside it was an ear of a shadow man. A large bite had been taken out of it. There was also a gnawed finger and a chunk of muscle, which had a handful of ice around it. What made me scream as loud as I did was that the same bag of ice contained 2 glazed shadow eyes, the pupils stretched and blurry. Suddenly we noticed the portal was open. Inside we could see George's pin-sized body flailing upwards at us at an alarming speed. I jumped at the objects, and with a sinking stomach, shoved them inside the box and covered them with what was left of the lid. I then slid it across the littered floor until it hit the wall with a thud. Georges then sailed out of the rainbow portal and hit the ground in a cloud of splinters and dust. He then clumsily got to his feet, and we all gasped. Georges stood there. At least I thought that was him. His face now was covered in boils. His skin was pale, and we could see his veins running underneath. His eyes were bloodshot and glassy. He was hunched over, and he looked at us with a stony glance. His eyes then widened as he looked at his ruined kitchen. "What the slunder happened here?" he croaked, his eyes still fixed on us. "Oh, George, Joe began, but Georges interrupted him briskly. "It doesn't matter. I'll be out of this dump soon anyway." He looked around and locked gazes with me, his cold eyes slitting. I smiled fakely and pulled the shaking Amy close to me. She had just watched Georges fall out of a rip in space. I would be shaking too. "I got Amy," I said, breaking the silence. "But it's getting late. We'll both go home." George's eyes ran up and down Amy, and I frowned. At this point, I wanted to grab her and Joe and sprint away from that house and all that we had uncovered in the past week. I was going insane, and I was becoming almost hypnotized. How long could I keep this up before I looked like Georges did? Georges snatched up a stone and inspected it. I longed to hold a stone as well, kiss it, embrace it. Georges sensed my love for them and clenched his fist over it. He frowned. I grabbed a stone for myself, almost to meet his challenge. He froze and smiled, but I frowned. Amy stared at both of us, puzzled. "Ready?" Chapter 14. Joe's Breakdown. Today was the day of our new lives. I took off my tattered, bloody clothes and hopped in the shower. I got into George's old clothes and marveled on how much my cuts had healed in the mirror. When I got out of the bathroom, I saw Joe and the fresh but anxious Amy. She immediately started asking questions, but I ignored her for the minute. Georges glanced over at me and grinned. "Hey, you all cleaned up for our big adventure?" Georges said. "Georges, I don't know. This whole fiasco." "Shut up, Joe," Georges snapped. "Jim?" Georges looked over at me questionably. "Georges, I have to agree with Joe," I stuttered. "No, no," Georges grabbed a dish off the table and hurled it across the room. "You will not walk out on me now." Georges picked up a stone and held it up to my face. "You are going. No one's leaving." He picked up another and threw it at my shoe. I grabbed his hand and pulled him close. "Georges, stop. Just destroy those stones and be done with it," I screamed. Georges only smiled. "We're not going insane, Jimbo. We're just beginning to understand." "What does that mean?" I yelled, kicking one of the stones away with my shoe. Georges pulled away from me. "Can't you feel it?" It wasn't a question. "Can't you feel the vibrations inside your mind? Can't you feel yourself changing?" He looked at his shadow hands and grinned even wider. I sat down next to the frightened Amy and held her hand. "I'm just so confused," I replied. Georges bent down next to me and Amy. "You don't have to be." Joe looked at us, the third stone held tightly in his fingers. He stared deep into me, searching my soul. He quickly looked away. I nodded and led Amy over to where the stones lay. I knew the world was evil and monstrous, but I didn't care at that point. All my senses were depleted. Like it or not, I was too far into this mystery. But did I want to get the love of my life into this? I looked over into her beautiful face and slowly kissed her, interrupting yet another one of her questions. I broke away from her and looked back into the stones that beckoned me forward. Now, once we get into the portal, everyone try to grab the 3 stones up above your heads, okay? I nodded and Joe did too. Amy just looked directly into my eyes. I looked away. Georges smiled and beckoned me to begin the procedure. He dropped one of the stones at my feet, next to the other one. I nudged them both together until a thin spark of black electricity cracked, which made my heart jump. I shot a look towards Joe, who held the last piece of the puzzle. Joe did not waste a minute before dropping the last stone into the pile. Once it struck the other 2, the portal opened like a trapdoor. Joe was closest and stepped inside. Georges followed, grinning back at us. Amy screeched, clawing at my chest before being pulled towards it. She was sucked out of my arms. I was lost, my eyes dazed, my body numb. Sure enough, there were 3 blazing circles hovering above the first corner in the tunnel. The stones! Joe clumsily grabbed for them, his fingers only skimming the portal ceiling. Not even close. Georges was ready, though, and he stuck his hand quickly into the greenish electric wall and howled in pain. Georges disappeared around the corner, still screaming. Amy spun right past the target, her voice distant, her limbs flailing. I slammed my fists into the ceiling of the portal and felt blinding pain slice across my hands. I quickly withdrew them. My thoughts trailed off, and the next thing I knew, I was tumbling shoulder first to the earth. I collided with the dirt, still yelling. The pain was just so overwhelming. Georges grasped my arms and shook me awkwardly. He was also yelling excitedly, and so was Joe. I opened my eyes and saw that Georges held a stone in a charred, scabbed hand. He was smiling wildly, grasping my sore shoulder, but I frowned. What about the other 2, Georges? Why are you so happy? I muttered, breathlessly. Then I looked down at my scorching fingers. I gasped, and then laughed wearily. I held the other 2 painted rocks in my bleeding hands. We had successfully gotten the stones to the other world. We whooped proudly and gathered together in celebration. However, the portal had still not closed overhead, and Amy had still not surfaced. When I noticed her absence, I looked up at the fading portal, electricity of all colors reaching down at us. I saw Amy falling toward us, her eyes alive, her body limp. I yelled for her, but she was too distant. The portal closed, but only half of Amy's body was protruding from the electric bolts. She still fell down into my arms, screaming wildly. I screamed too, the stones clattering to the dirt. The portal had closed on Amy's arm, which had still been inside the tunnel, and it had kept her hand. The tunnel had made a clean cut at her wrist. There was no blood. Her wound had been cauterized. Amy passed out in my arms, her blackened stump resting on my shoulder blade. I stared wide-eyed at my 2 friends, who gave me the same look. My fiancée was injured, robbed of her hand. I sat down with her and cradled her in my arms. Look what you've done! I screamed at Georges, as if it was his fault. I set Amy down gently and pounced at Georges. Georges fell back, and I plunged my fist into his face, and he screeched in pain. Joe tried to pull me off, but I stabbed my elbow into his chest. He heaved a hoarse breath before falling backwards. I smacked Georges in the mouth one more time before I felt the tip of his revolver stab into my intestines. I froze, and Georges hissed for me to roll off of him. I did so and sprang to my feet. Georges was up too, the gun aimed right at my chest. It's loaded, Jim. I backed away, my hands to the sky. Georges, please. I was upset, I murmured. Without lowering his weapon, he wiped the blood from his nose and lip. He grinned and held the gun out even further. He shook his head and cocked the revolver. I gasped and closed my eyes as he fired. When I was still standing, I looked up at Georges, who had already put the gun away. A large red bird hit the ground some 20 feet away, its chest naked of feathers and bloody. Great shot, huh? Georges boasted, laughing at my fear. I sat down with a thud and pulled the unconscious Amy towards me. Joe stood up, his chest heaving. Georges grabbed him and pushed him towards the dwarfed land sky off in the distance. You know the drill, let's go, Georges screamed. But Georges, Amy's hurt. Georges slapped Joe savagely across his cheek, which made him pull back. Go! He looked over at me and beckoned with his blistered fingers. I gathered Amy in my arms, and we hiked towards the airport. I already missed our old Earth, but I still had my sanity. Every second I was there in the Shadow Earth, it was getting worse. We were sitting in the land sky, each of us holding one of the stones. I cradled Amy in my arms. At this point in time, I just wanted to grab all those stones and steal away. leaving George's as far away as possible. Joe had his head in his hands. George's gave me a sharp look, both electrifying and dazed. I began to shake, but I could not look away. George smiled wickedly, his swollen lip curling away like an unveiling curtain. I started to moan under my breath. The man at my right cut the awkward silence by pulling me out of my seat and pushing me toward the doorway of the plane. We had arrived at the Lawsdor Kingdom. I nodded my head and carefully toted my fiancée down the rope coil until I was on the landing pad. Georges came up next to me. Joe was still up in the land sky, and he was hesitating at the entrance. The employee smiled carefully at Joe and made a movement with his hand towards the exit. Joe now was sweating. He shook his head towards the man and scrunched up against the wall. The man grabbed his arm and tried to direct him, but Joe screamed bloody murder and smashed the employee over the head with his knuckle. The man screeched and fell to his knees. Joe punted the man in his ribs. They cracked, and the man tumbled backwards out of the land sky. I saw his body plummeting at us, and I quickly gathered my fiancée and jumped away. The man fell 150 feet and crashed with the earth with a bone-crushing splat. Up ahead, other land-sky guards were now attacking Joe and had smashed him up against the wall. Joe moaned in pain as one of the guards slammed his head into the cold metal. Joe reached blindly and caught one of them by the ankle. He knocked that one onto his back and kicked another right in the shin. The men fell away for a second, and Joe crawled to the exit and out of the doorway, his fingers wrapped around the rope. His legs were still in the plane, so one of the men grabbed him by his pant cuff. Another grabbed his other leg. Joe freed one of his hands and pulled another man down to his death. The other became afraid and let go of Joe's cuff, so that Joe fell head first downwards, hanging onto the rope with one hand. I watched Joe as he fell, screaming. In air, Joe grabbed the rope with his other hand, slowing himself considerably, and by the time he stopped, he was only a few feet above us, screaming. Then the land sky started to move, taking Joe with it. I screamed for my friend. Joe swung around in the air, desperately, his head tucked into his coat, his eyes closed tightly. His legs were wrapped around the rope. "Joe, you're not too far from the ground. Let go!" Georgia screamed. Joe nodded and, without looking down, released his grasp and fell to the earth hard, in a plume of dust. We ran to his aid. He was still sobbing, his legs kicking in the dirt. I bent down and slapped him hard, until he immediately halted and stared into my face. "What the hell were you thinking?" I screamed at him. I got back to my feet and turned towards George's, who was once again holding the gun. It was directed toward Joe. "You're dead weight, Joe. I can't keep you on this mission. It's too much for you," Georges said. "Oh, Georges, you can't do this," I screamed. Joe instantly looked up, through his teary eyes, right into the gun's barrel. I pounced on Georges and intercepted the gun with perfect accuracy. I fired a shot into his foot. Georges groaned and stumbled backwards, teetering on the cliff behind him. I could see that it broke off from the platform. I noticed this and pistol-whipped Georges across the face, before pushing him in the chest, my hand coming away with a piece of his shirt. Georges fell backwards off the edge of the cliff, and the last thing I heard was him screaming my name. I collapsed next to Amy and Joe and huffed a sigh of relief. I let the gun roll away from my hand. Joe pulled up next to me and squinted in disbelief. "How are we supposed to get home?" "He got the stone," Joe huffed. I unclenched my other hand to reveal the front pocket of George's shirt, which had contained the stone. By tearing off his pocket, I had taken the stone with it. All 3 rocks were now in my possession. I smiled at Joe, and he smiled back at me. We hugged each other and squeezed each other's shoulders. A thin ray of sunlight was breaking through the black clouds, like thin fingers that grappled with the edge of the cliff. Three Quarters from Heaven, Chapter 15, A Chance to Exit. Joe looked at me stunned, his arm shaking, his jaw hanging open. I could see his teeth, which were now yellow and sharp. I knew mine had to be the same. I was shaking too. I raised the gun to eye level to marvel at it. This was not an ordinary weapon. This was a tool to hunt, a tool to kill. "You killed Georges," Joe moaned. I looked up at him from my daze and quickly pocketed the tool. I took 2 stones and threw them into a pile. I retrieved the third from my own pocket. I locked gazes with Joe for a minute, who hadn't even moved yet. "Joe, we're leaving," I said calmly, but inside I was a wreck. Joe just stood there like an idiot, shaking like a leaf. "We worked so hard to get here, all for nothing. Your hands are badly burned, and I'm turning into one of them. For God's sake, look at your wife. All for nothing," Joe screamed. "Joe, please, you want to leave?" "I need to leave," I began, pulling out George's gun again, although I didn't know why. "Let's go." I threw the last stone into the pile with the rest, and the portal bloomed into life. It won't stay open for long, so let's go. I felt the portal sucking at me, but didn't move from my spot. I pulled Amy close, who was now stirring in her sleep. I do want to leave, but this is all happening so fast. Give me a second, Joe said, crouching to his knees. He gagged and vomited into the dirt. Joe, please, I yelled, pointing the gun at his head. Joe then looked up at me, and I'll never forget what I saw in his eyes. I saw death. His eyes were yellow and had slit pupils like the shadow people. Tears streamed down from them. Human tears. They were bigger and brighter, but still Joe's. I could sense him behind those eyes, but the shadow mask was hiding it. He burst into tears as I lowered my weapon. I was just about to run to him when Georges appeared behind Joe, blood engulfing his face, shadow eyes burning with anger. His purple lips curled into a grimace, revealing sharp, shark-like teeth. He had a long steak knife in his hand he pulled from his belt. I screamed out and even raised my gun. I shot blindly into the air, but only hit the sky. I was too late. Georges pounced on Joe's back and without hesitation slit across Joe's neck. Joe screamed, but only got out a deaf squeak. Blood splurted from his throat like a river, painting the air platform. His eyes were his own now, blue and normal-sized. They were full of pain and death, but were strong. Joe was telling me he was going to die, right? Not as a monster, but as a friend. I shot again, but only at air. I reloaded, but was cut short. A land sky came into view overhead, and 5 long steel cords unveiled from above. You've lost, Jim. You've become the enemy, Georges screeched with glee, tossing Joe to the ground. You did this to yourself. Now give me the gun. 20 officers were now sliding down from the aircraft, clad with weapons. I looked up to my doom, then to Georges, to Joe, who was now reaching into his pocket, gasping for air. Then the twirling vortex behind me. I was about to yank Amy by the arm and jump to the portal, but if I didn't grab the stones, I'd be whisked back to the shadow world in an hour's time, probably to arrows pointed at my head. I wasn't going to give up without a fight. I cocked my gun and shot up into the air, picking off 2 from the ladders. Arrows were now being shot down at me, and one nicked my arm, but didn't stay in my shoulder. I yelled in pain and shot the archer in his eye. He fell to his death. I got 2 more before they reached the platform and pounced on me. I shot one in the shin and sent him off the cliff. Another arrow embedded itself in my thigh, and I collapsed to my knees. I shot 5 times and only injured 2 in the process. An arrow passed by my head and tore a good piece of my right ear off. I aimed and fired, cracking one soldier's rib cage to splinters. That's about when Georges rear-ended me and slammed me to the ground. He sliced across my back, and I elbowed him right in the mouth, knocking out many of his front teeth. He fell off of me, but a soldier got down face to face, and I ended up uppercutting him in the jaw. He shot his arrow dumbly into the air. I turned to face Georges, who was spitting out his blood. I screamed in protest as I realized what he was doing. He had Amy pulled up to his chest, the knife resting just below her chin. She was awake now and was wide-eyed, her gaze directed at me. Amy! I yelled. Georges laughed, and I raised the gun at George's head. A gun shot went off, but not mine. George's was struck in between his armpit and rib cage. That part of his chest ripped off in a bloody mass as his screams of anguish echoed across the valley. Amy fled into my arms as an arrow struck me in my forearm. Joe was clutching his own hunting revolver he'd used when we sometimes went to the firing range. He smiled at me, his eyes certainly his own. They rolled backwards and he fell sideways in his last breath. Georges hit the platform hard, writhing in his own blood. I gathered Amy in my arms. The soldiers weren't focused on me anymore. They were crowding around the closing portal and helping a yelping Georges to his feet. I found my time to escape and fled into the woods south of the platform. I didn't stop running. Not even to rest, not even to look back. I just kept running, Amy bouncing in my arms, 3 arrows protruding from my body. I didn't stop. As I ran, the landscape around me blurred, and Amy stared restlessly at her stump of a hand. I ran and ran until I came upon the bank of the Derringer Lake, where a small ship was making its way across the currents. 2 soldiers were huddled over Georges, who was sprawled out on the deck. Even from where I was, I could hear his screams of pain and anger. They were on their way to the palace with Georges and the stones, and I had to stop them. Chapter 16. The Race. I fell to my hands and knees and wept. I wept for Amy, Georges, and Joe. All were being hurt or killed by this new world. Georges was dying, but this still wasn't over. It should have been, after all I'd gone through, but it wasn't. I wanted desperately to get home, but not if the Shadow King got there first. And if he did, I'd have to stay in his new world, where Georges would rule and hunt me for game. Amy came up from behind me and kissed me on my gray, blood-stained chin. I kissed her back, and we fell to the ground in warm embrace. I helped Amy up onto the cliff, some 20 feet above the Derringer. We couldn't take the lake, so we'd have to go around, which was very rocky and treacherous. I told Amy everything that had happened to me over the week as we hiked on, but I cut it pretty short. I clung on to a vine hanging from a rocky ledge and edged my way upwards, Amy hanging onto my shoulders. I stepped on to a patch of pebbles and slipped backwards, scraping my upper body. I tore open my new jeans and tore off the skin on my arm. The arrow head I couldn't fish out of my thigh wedged into my muscle even more. I gritted my teeth and continued onwards. About 10 minutes later, the same land sky as before hovered over our heads. I got down into a sharp thicket with Amy as it passed by. I pulled myself out with a few scratches, and we followed a path down the cliffside, which would meet up with the back of the kingdom. There on the path, 4 soldiers were winding upwards with bows, arrows, and wooden spears. I once again found us a hiding spot. We took the way around the path, which was through thick foliage of orange plants and towering canopies. I must have stepped somewhere wrong because a huge army of feather-winged beasts burst from the trees from our left and right. "Run!" I yelled to Amy. That was later answered by a barrage of arrows and flying spears. There were more of them now. I whipped out my gun and quickly cocked it. Amy watched me in awe as I shot squarely at a soldier, decapitating him instantly. They were now coming in from every angle, and I only had a few more bullets left. I hauled her up quickly and gathered a spear for ammo. Amy trailed along behind me, blood curling down the curves of her nose. She only screamed once, though. A soldier fell from my left, and I stabbed weakly out at him. He was only scathed, but I managed to ease away from his flying arrows. Another sprang out of the bushes to Amy's right and flung a spear at my feet. I leapt over it and stabbed him in the neck. I left the spear, but helped myself to a bow and 2 arrows. Letting Amy stumble ahead, I turned and figured out its mechanics. I pulled and released an arrow from the bow and was able to strike one soldier in the chest. He flinched comically in one spot before collapsing into another attacking soldier. I gasped as 5 land skies burst from the overhanging clouds where soldiers were dropping like meteors. I released my last arrow, but I was only able to hit a tree trunk. I turned and sprinted through the plants with Amy as the jungle behind us was trampled down by thousands of guards. Arrows rained from the sky and spears from all sides. I was scathed by some, and others struck into my lower back or arms. I would only tear them out from my own flesh and string them onto my bow. I shot a glance behind me to see a herd of thousands of soldiers leaping and sprinting at us with great agility. Some would jump high into the air until their heads grazed the branches above. I wasn't watching where I was scurrying, so I smashed my shin into a high-hanging root, and I flipped perfectly off the ground and onto the path into a large muddy ditch. I slid down it, smashing it to small boulders and launching off of dead tree stumps. The ditch soon broke off and fell at a 90-degree angle, down into a deep puddle of disregarded rainwater and mud. I grasped onto anything I could find around me, roots, boulders, trees, but my muddy hands only slid off. Then there was nothing to stop me, so I dragged my heels and dug my palms into the deep mud. It slowed me down a bit, but didn't stop me from my fall. I fell legs first off the cliff. I closed my eyes and pulled my knees to my chest as I fell for what seemed like 10 minutes. Then, like a smash from thousands of rocks the size of human fists, I hit the water. My legs hit the shallow bottom, and I felt them buckle into the soft soil below. Right when my cheeks felt the icy hot sting of the water, I fell unconscious. I woke up with my face down in the water. I lifted myself out of the dirt and coughed out what I had inhaled. I grabbed onto the mud and painfully pulled myself out. I got to my feet and realized my shoes were still in the puddle. I leaned up against the tree and wiped the sludge off of my eyes. It hadn't been a deep puddle, but when I hit it I must have been stunned for only a few seconds. My clothes were weighing me down, so I tore off my socks and shirt. Above me I heard the cries of the shadow men and the firing of arrows. But what happened to Amy? No one had noticed where I had gone, but had they gotten Amy? An arrow landed in the puddle with a small plop. I looked up alarmed, brushing away my dirt-encrusted hair. I heard cries and the sloshing of mud. More than one of the guards had seen me fall and were coming after me. I started to run, but my shins and ankles were bruised and sprained. I moaned and decided to limp away. As I made my way into another forest hangover, I heard screams and the splash of the puddles. I snuck a peek over my shoulder as one of the Darmy men was pulling himself out of the lapping water. He pulled a spear from his belt and snarled a warning at me. I got the gun out and decided to waste one of my bullets. I found him on the ground, but knew he was going to leap upward, so I shot in the air. Sure enough, the stupid creature jumped right into the bullet, tearing off his forehead. I gathered his spear, turning to wait for the rest. They all jumped at me, but I was able to stab 2 of them. One stabbed me in my already blood-soaked shoulder. I screamed and flung the spear in one arc. I was bathed in a spray of blood. It fell on me like a bag of compost. More were coming, and I heaved desperately at the dead weight. When I finally did, 8 more soldiers were easing their way out of the mud, all snarling, either spears or bows and arrows on their belts. I threw the spear weakly, and it only turned over in the air and plopped in the mud. They jumped at me as I sprinted away, despite the agonizing pain. I fled as arrows and spears were hot on my trail. I needed to get to the palace before Georges did. I needed to stop his horrible plan. I needed to save the world. Ahead of me was only a huge wall of brick, the surrounding wall of Law's door. I had made it. I hit the wall and climbed it ferociously. When a spear struck at my scalp and fell away, I kept climbing. When my fingernails tore out of my fingertips, I grasped for the top of the wall. Colors spilled across my eyes, and I was changing there on the top of the wall. There I was completing my fall into insanity. I screamed and laughed at the same time, as my skin transitioned to a shade of gray. I whooped with glee and cried out in pain as my tongue extended and slid out between my gums. I leaned over the wall right as my eyes tinted yellow. I fell, but my sight came back to me like a light switching on in a dark alleyway. I landed neatly on my feet in the law's door courtyard. I looked at my hands, which were now shadow hands. My nails were long, sharp, and black. I ran my serpent tongue over my teeth and found them sharp. I ran my hand through my hair, and clumps of it fell away in my fingers. Out of the courtyard doors came a running shadow man. I leapt up without even thinking and clocked him across his head with my fist. He fell on his face, and I bit into his arm. I tore a piece of flesh off the bone and swallowed it dryly. I put the gun in my waistband and strode into the open courtyard doors. I walked inside forgetting Amy or Joe. Inside I would meet either failure with death or victory with death. There was no way of cheating my demise at this point. Chapter 17. Betrayal. It was like stepping into a minefield, triggered by the first step, a minefield of arrows and spears. The great hall of Law's door was swarmed with armed shadow men, all aiming right at my temple. I stopped right where I was, letting the doors behind me swing closed. Georges stepped into view, pushing many of the soldiers out of his way. He was frowning sadly and was holding the bullet wound Joe had given him. He was also holding Joe's firing pistol. It wasn't aimed at me, but was hanging at his side, cocked. "Jim, oh Jim, what on earth do you plan to do?" Georges said, down his nose to me. "I would just give up now, before more arrows are added to your collection there." There was a few snickers around him. I was about to raise my own weapon when Georges rose his. His serpent tongue was rolling out of his grin. His eyes were now electric and alive. "Jim, if you want to keep your head, I would think twice," Georges said. "If you want to keep Amy, I'd also think twice." Amy was thrust through the crowd, a ball gag in her mouth, and a sturdy rope around her wrists. She was sobbing and yelling muffled words under her gag. I kept my hands at my sides as Georges nodded his head. His gun didn't falter, though. He jerked his head in my direction as a guard behind me snatched my free hands and tied them together. Georges told the guard I could keep my weapon and the ball gag out of my mouth. "The weapon is for when you're rotting away in the dungeon, so you can have sweet relief," Georges mocked as Amy and I were led through the crowd and up a spiraling staircase of maybe 10 floors. I gave Amy a loving glance, and she returned it. It was too late. The stones were now in the king's hands, and Amy and I were now vulnerable to just about anything. Georges opened the double doors at the top of the stairs. Inside, the soldiers pushed into a room covered from floor to ceiling with fine art and statues. This was much different than the room we met the king in a few weeks ago. This was much bigger and nicer, most likely his throne room. Sure enough, the throne sat before us, sat atop a large platform. The king sat in it, looking a lot older than I remembered him. His jeweled crown twinkled in the candlelight around us. He was wrapped elegantly in a red silk cloak that seemed too big for him. Amy and I were coerced to our knees in front of the platform. The guards and Georges followed suit. "So, my lord, what shall we do with these foes?" George said, which didn't sound at all like him. He got back to his feet, and the 2 guards stepped away. We remained on our knees. "Leave them. They deserve to see their own world be taken away," the king pronounced. "Excellent, my king," Georges cried. "So should we make the trade now? I can see the stones are on your table over there." "No, Mr. Georges, we shan't," the king said. He got down from his throne and passed by the dumbfounded Georges. The king limped over to the bookcase that lined the whole wall. He reached up high and let a dusty, battered book fall into his hand. "Excuse me, my lord?" Georges asked. "Mr. Georges, this novel is called The Bind Between Us, and it is written by a literature professor of the 1800s. He once prophesied that God created Earth twice the size as the one you know today." He pointed at each one of us with his curled nail. But this Earth contained so many people of too many different races and families. So God decided to split this planet into two different Earths, one you know, and the one we stand in now. But to make sure these planets never converged again, each was hidden from one another's view. The only way to travel from Earth 1, your Earth, to Earth 2, mine, was 3 stones God created just in case the real Earth needed to be joined together. So after a while, God decided he didn't need the stones, so he hid them on your Earth, Mr. Georges. And you, by chance, found them. But this novel was only a hypothesis of sorts. There was no way to prove it, so people thought this author was insane. He didn't stop there, though. He had artists create statues with 2 ends of the real Earth, each connected by a rainbow, as you've probably seen in my courtyard. He tried desperately to get his idea to stick, but it didn't. The king went over to the table with the stones and picked up a medallion with the 2 sides of the Earth and the rainbow engraved on it. One end was plentiful and the other cracked and black. I collected all his works and his art because I was fascinated. I believed in his story while everyone else didn't. But just like him, I didn't have proof. In his novel, he wrote that if the 3 stones were retrieved, the portal between us would be opened. Only if we destroy 2 of them, the portal would open, connecting our worlds. If 3 were destroyed, the portal would be gone for good, with the stones. So you see, Georges, you gave me my proof. The stones. He held the medallion out in front of Georges. You have finished my life's work and the author's dream. I can finally connect the Earth and I will be able to rule it. I rule this half. Why not the other half? The king chuckled. No, 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 my lord. What about our bargain? I'd have this world and you'd have mine, Georges rebuffed. Oh, come now, Mr. Georges. Do you really think I'd believe you were the king of Earth? You're kidding, the king replied. I knew you were going to destroy them once I went through. I'm not an idiot. George's, Amy's, and my jaw dropped. Georges didn't have anything to say. He just stood there, stiff as a board, his hands shaking like leaves. But my lord, we had a bargain, Georges screeched. His yellow eyes started to gloss over with tears. With a blink of an eye, the king nodded his wrinkled head. One of the guards sprang forward and let a spear roll off his long fingers and jut perfectly into George's gut. Georges screamed and hurried forward, blood seeping out of his mouth. He fell to his knees. The king strode forward and dropped his steel medallion at George's knees. Destroy the stones, he said calmly before getting back into his throne. The guard who had thrown the spear came over to the table where the stones sat. He reached for a large golden brick and lifted it over his head with both hands. The guard behind us and the king were leaning forward with anticipation. Georges looked up at the table with tearful eyes. He hacked up more blood onto the medallion. I yelped with fright as the brick hit the first stone with a head-blowing crack. There was a shot of bright, blinding light. Then the brick and the stone split into 2 halves. The struck rock now turned from a bright red to a dull gray. Then, without further notice, the portal appeared where the king's bookcase once stood. Only this portal was like a window to my own Earth. It showed me the street corner of George's house, where this had all started. The portal was only the size of a regular-sized skylight, but I could see the whole block in a full view of George's own pale white house. My car was still parked in the driveway. The king laughed excitedly and Georges moaned in pain and frustration. A hammer didn't break one of those damn things, but a brick does, I thought bitterly. The other, the king exclaimed. He was now hanging off his throne like a kid. The guard nodded and snatched another golden brick from the table and lifted it over his helmeted head. Georges yelled out in anguish through a spray of blood. He fell over onto his hands and knees, screaming his protest. There was another loud crack of the stone splitting and of the brick shattering under the soldier's hands. There was a bright white light and a bolt of blue electricity surged through the throne room. The window portal now slowly extended its capacity until it took up the whole wall. It didn't even look like there was any kind of break between the worlds. It looked like, truly, the real Earth had returned, whole and strong. The king limped up to the portal and stuck his arm through where the wall had once stood. He snapped his fingers for the other soldier. Take the 3 to the dungeon and call for army forces 1, 2, and 3, the king announced. We're going to take this world by storm. Then he turned to the soldier by the table and told him to keep the last stone safe in his armor. The soldier did so. The soldier forced Amy and I to our feet and led us to the doors. Another soldier from out in the hall yanked Georges up by his collar and dragged him after us. As we left, I saw the king dancing up and down in front of the portal. He would step in and out of the 2 worlds as he whooped in gratification. No, we had a bargain, Georges screeched as the double door shut in front of us, taking us away from our home once again. Chapter 18. Search for the Stone. We were taken to the exact dungeon Joe and I had been thrown in the last time we were here. I didn't struggle like Amy and Georges. I was too shocked as to what had just taken place. All of this was happening so fast. Suddenly all our fates were sealed, and my world was as well. This all seemed like a bad dream. George's plan, which Joe and I had thought was a horrific idea in the first place, had backfired. Now we were all going to rot, until we all killed ourselves. The trapdoor was wrenched open. The guard holding Amy and I pushed me aside and shoved Amy harshly forward into the open hatch. Amy struck her shins on the way down, and I could hear her stilted screams. I heard a dull plop at the bottom. No, you don't understand. I'm the king of this world. I'm the king. You must obey me. No, Georges screamed as the other soldier struck him across the head with the blunt edge of his spear. Georges made a dry scream before he toppled forward, smashing his shoulders. Then his body slowly tilted to the side and he fell headfirst down the cellar. I could also hear him screeching and clawing at the soil walls around him. Another dull plop and more screams and curses. Now you go, Askell, the soldier holding me snapped. I nodded and crouched down next to the trapdoor. I struck my legs inside the hatch and with one deep breath, scooched myself forward. I struck the soft mud and sank into it, feeling all the bones from my waist down rattle. I keeled over and fell face first into the muck. I maintained consciousness somehow and laid there, face first, where I was, recuperating. Then I heard a pistol cocked behind me. Get up, you frascant, Georges called at me. I said get up. I moaned achingly and got onto my knees. I wiped the mud from my eyes. Georges stood in front of me, caked in fresh mud. The spear in his gut was now gone, revealing his crying wound. Joe's pistol was aimed at my forehead once again. His eyes were now glowing yellow, like the sun, his lips curled up in a scowl. Come on, Georges, I whimpered. Let's just... No, you ruined this for me. If you and Joe hadn't come between me and the king, Georges yelled, it's because of you he was annoyed. He thought I'd do the same. That's how he knew about my plan. Georges, shut up, Georges screeched. I hate you. He shot at me, but missed by only an inch. The mud to the left of me exploded in a shower of dirt. Georges recoiled from the shot and held his wound with his free hand. He moaned in agony. I sprang sorely to my feet and plowed forward at Georges. I took him off the ground and smashed him into the mud. The pistol was brandished at me, but I uppercutted Georges in the chin. My hand reached for my waistband and fumbled for my own gun. Georges helped himself up by the wall next to him and cocked his weapon again. Georges then struck me across my temple with the pistol. Stars exploded in front of my eyes as I fell off of him. He helped himself up by the wall next to him and cocked his weapon again. I fell onto all my rogue arrows, but they only snapped off my back. Georges shot again, and the bullet struck the wall above me. Fragments of the soil wall rained down across my face. Oh! Georges fell against the wall, clutching his guts. Blood ran down his fingers. I dusted off the soil and sat up. As fresh blood trickled down my cheek, I whipped out my gun. I aimed it quickly at Georges. He looked up at me and growled with anger. He raised his own weapon and fired, but he hadn't cocked it. He started running at me, pulling the trigger randomly with no discharge. Georges stumbled and fell on me, but I kneed him brutally in his neck. He gagged and struck the gun forcefully into my side. I howled and tried to push him off me. George's knee was on my hand, which held the gun, so I tried my hardest to shift his weight. Georges grasped me by the neck and forced the back of my head into the dungeon wall behind me. I heard him cock his pistol. His face was inches from mine. It was muddy and gray. His lips were purple and the teeth behind them glowed bright red. His eyes were open to their full extent, evil and not his. All I knew was I couldn't let this horrible beast live any longer. This wasn't my poker buddy. This was a mask. This was an evil costume. I slipped the gun out from under George's knee and put it into alignment with his heart. I heard a loud discharge, and then George's ribcage splitting. Then there was a warm spray of blood on my face. There was a soft gag, and George's fell backward off of me. The pistol fell from his hand and struck me on my shoulder. George's was dead. I caught my breath, and that's when I remembered Amy. I scrambled to my feet and limped around the dungeon, edging across the shackles on the walls and the discarded human bones on the ground. Amy, can you hear me? I asked. The dungeon was basically dark besides the light from up above through the dungeon door cracks. So I edged about carefully calling her name until my feet struck something hard. I bent down slowly to inspect it. Felt around, and it was indeed Amy. I pulled her close and into the shred of light. Amy! No answer. I looked closely at Amy's face. It was twisted. Her eyes were open and rolled back. Her mouth was wide open, a long trickle of blood running down her chin. Amy! I started to sob. That's when I noticed her head was tilted at a 90-degree angle. I lifted her head up in my hand and then cried out. Her neck was broken, most likely from the fall. I lifted her in my arms and pulled her close. I sobbed bitterly into her bosom, cursing God for taking away my love. I held her like that for maybe 30 minutes, calling her name to the dripping ceiling. Once I placed her back into the soft mud and made the cross symbol on her forehead, my left hand landed upon a diary. I picked it up and examined it. It was a diary owned by some prisoner a long time ago. I flipped through the pages and found them all soggy and empty. There was some odd ballpoint-shaped pen in the binding of it. I rested my back up against the wall and held the small notebook across my bare chest. I looked over at my best friend's corpse lying dormant in the mud. I had killed my best friend, the man I knew since I was young. That's when I set this diary open in front of me and began my tale. All around me sat the dead bodies of people I had once loved, and the world and home I had once loved was now being destroyed above my head. I couldn't do anything about it, so I wrote. The stench was overwhelming and the moisture was freezing my body. I decided to take George's shirt, which was long-sleeved and would keep me warm. I carefully lifted him upwards and felt something inside him crack. I slipped it over his head and winced at the smell and grotesque appearance of his exposed intestines. It had seemed like a few hours since I'd been down there. So far I had gotten halfway through my journal. I curled up next to it and started to write again, but sleep soon found me. I fell into my dreams, and when I woke again, some 10 hours later, the war of the earth would just be getting interesting. I did wake, but I knew it had to be night. The light from the trapdoor above was absent, but my eyes soon adjusted. I went back to my journal, but was distracted by the stench of George's and Amy. I folded my journal into my pants and crawled away from the two, kissing Amy on the lips one last time. The light was just coming back from above, so I decided to return to my journal. That's when hunger struck me. I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast a day ago. The arrowheads were still lodged in my flesh, too, and they were starting to get infected and turning purple. I was cold all the time, so I wrapped my blue hands in a dead body's old tattered shirt. I decided to cleanse myself, so I used the shirt to wipe the mud from all over my body. I finished my journal and fell asleep again. When I woke up, I felt like an icicle, and my stomach was growling with hunger. I couldn't even get up to pee anymore. I had no energy whatsoever. I wanted to throw up a number of times, but I only got stomach acid out. I knew I was desperately sick, but I couldn't manage much longer. I noticed the ceiling was dripping a pretty continuous trickle of rainwater into a puddle to my right. I crawled over to it and drank heartily. Although it was muddy and covered with bacteria, my stomach gladly accepted. I didn't drink all of it, but decided to let the puddle grow more in capacity. The light above me was now getting dimmer, signaling nightfall again. That meant I had been down there for a day. I rubbed my covered hands together to keep warm, but I felt like my blood was chilled. Then I found Joe's pistol next to George's corpse. I brought it back to my wall and held it in my hands. It still had a round in it. I kept remembering what Georges had said about me putting myself out of my own misery as I rotted in this dungeon. Could I take my own life? I started to cry and fell asleep again, the pistol held close to my heart. I woke and decided to drink. The puddle was pretty full, so I took in a lot of the cool, satisfying water, but my stomach still demanded food. I didn't want to pee anymore next to my spots, so I made my way into the darkness. I followed the soggy wall with my hand, but it suddenly dropped off. I paused and stared into the pitch black. I could barely see the wall, and it did indeed have some kind of outgrove built into it, like a hallway in the wall. I started towards it, and I found I was in a long hallway winding forwards. I ventured forth down the hallway, edging along carefully. It seemed to go on for maybe 30 minutes, until my blind hand rested upon a heavy door. I felt a handle in the door jam. I tried to open it, but it was, of course, locked. I drew out my gun and fired 3 bullets into the handle. I saw light ahead of me, which momentarily blinded my vision. I pried a piece of wood out from the door frame and stumbled out of the dungeon. I fell across a grassy hill outside of Law's door. I squinted upwards and saw the portal wide open before Law's door palace, reaching up to the sky and ending at the ground. The earth was now truly connected. I could see what was left of George's block. It was blotted out by fire, and the sky above was blood red. I heard machine guns firing and the flocks of flaming arrows raining down from the sky. I could see tanks plowing over many of the creatures. It was a very depressing scene. Since I was too weak to walk, I decided to crawl up the grassy knoll to get a better view. Once I did, I could see some small skirmishes occurring in the shadow world as well. A tank shell exploded over my head and struck the electric antenna above me. It exploded in a spray of sparks and collapsed into the lower level of the palace as it fell. Rows and rows of shadow soldiers lined up, orderly, arrows strung in their bows. Then a swarm of American soldiers collided with them, responding with assault rifles and machine guns. There was a spray of blood and body parts, so I looked away. Now I knew what I had to do. I had to find the guard who held the last stone, and I had a hunch if I found the king, I'd find the guard. At George's street corner, there was a circle of bodyguards surrounding someone. The king! Of course the king wasn't going to miss this. I proceeded forward toward my old world. No one noticed me as I passed through the portal. Chapter 19. Last Ray of Hope. It was getting worse before it got better. The shadow creatures were surely showing their upper hand. They had agility and strength no one on my earth could match. They would leap several feet up into the air and were able to rain their arrows or spears right into the soldiers' shoulders. The circle of bodyguards protecting the king weren't letting anyone get anywhere near him. The circle was even getting more and more protected. I could faintly see the king behind his men, cackling and craning his neck to see the battles. Creatures were on top of the roofs, raining down their fiery surprises. Grenades were showing a large opposition as well, but the shadow men were just too stealthy and quick-witted. All in all, we were losing. I dodged quickly behind a rolled-over truck and waited as a grenade went off. I took off with a painful limp towards the wall of bodyguards. They were situated right under George's house, and I saw one of the guards lead the king right into the open door. The door shut behind them. The king was in too much danger out there, so he was escorted into a safer place. But there were still about 20 men protecting all doors of George's house. How in the world was I going to get in there? That's when I took off the opposite way towards my soldiers. They had created a makeshift bunker with 3 tanks as a barrier. They were firing their weapons between the gaps. A few had rocket launchers pointed right at 3 other lines of shadow men. As I ran past, these SWAT teams were sprinting into the shadow world, all clad with rocket launchers and tear gas. Behind me, I heard 5 large explosions. I dove down behind another burning car. I looked back through the portal and saw Losdor engulfed like a torch. I knew it was no more. I looked to my left where an American soldier was operating an upright machine gun. An arrow struck him in the Adam's apple and he collapsed. The reason we weren't dominating was because our soldiers didn't know where to fire. I ran to the machine gun and changed its position. I aimed it at George's house, where the king was now on the roof with 10 other guards. He just wanted to get a better view, but I didn't want to fire right at him in case the guard with the stone got away. I just wanted to clear the front door. I looked down at the complex weapon in front of me and searched for the trigger. I found it and pulled. I lost control and it shot every which way. Bullet shells were exploding all around me and I fell away from the machine. I looked at George's house, where the entrance had not only been cleared, but blown open. But not by me. A grenade had sent the bodyguards through the whole front wall of the house. The guards above, though, went straight to the source and shot an arrow into the soldier's eye. I saw my opportunity and bolted through the wildfires, through the falling dead bodies, through the smoke, the blood, the rain of arrows, and through the rogue bullets. I took out my pistol and held it at my side. 2 shadow men came from either side of me. Each were holding an assault rifle they had stolen from their kills. So far, they were pretty accurate with them as well. 5 Americans trying to get into the shadow world were shot down from these 2 shadow creatures. Was there anything these things couldn't do? They aimed their weapons at me, but one of their heads cracked and fell off their shoulders from a rifle blast. I shot at the other, but was only able to strike one of his arms. He did fall over, giving me a better advantage. I took it and ran into the black smoke shielding the front door of George's house. I fell inside to see the entire house torn apart. Furniture, rugs, clocks, George's big screen, and George's grand piano were cluttered at the foot of the stairs to block the upper floor. I stepped over the dead bodies and started to climb over the clutter. Outside, I heard a large explosion, just outside the door again by a rocket launcher shell. Fire burst in through the house, and I was wrenched forward into the stairs above me. I struck my elbow hard, but was able to shake off the pain. I struggled forward up the top of the stairs. There was a shadow man dressed in a tattered work shirt and a tie. He stood beside me, clutching a spear. This was no soldier, but a civilian. They were sending civilians in now. This man had blood dripping down his mouth, and he looked angry. He struck at me. I hit the door and bounced off of it. The creature jumped at me and landed on my shoulders. I crumpled, but pulled the trigger of my weapon. The man screeched and died. I pulled him off of me and looked up. The attic door was pulled open above me, where the king had gone through. I cocked my gun and proceeded up the ladder into the attic. I poked my head through the shattered opening and pulled myself out into the heat. I clutched to the roof gutter with all my strength. The roof shingles burned my fingers, but I was able to free the rest of my body. My bare feet had rubbed against the glass shards from the broken window, so when I stood up I winced. "What the?" one of the shadow men cried. An arrow zipped past where my right ear had been. I fell to my stomach and shot right into the guard's shin. He threw his arms in the air and fell side first off the roof. An arrow then went into my thigh. I cocked my pistol again and rose to my feet. I shot another in the gut. He fired his arrow into the sky and died on the roof. He slid slowly off into the war below. I looked up and saw the only guard that wasn't attacking me was protecting the king with his entire body. This was the soldier with the stone. Another guard came at me with a spear, but I fired directly at his forehead. He fell apart and then died. I advanced slowly at the only 2 left, the bodyguard and the king. My weapon was high up, aimed at the soldier. "Give it up! You can't win!" I roared. "You! How did you get out?" the king growled. There was another huge blast, followed by smaller explosions. One was a tank's, others from rocket launchers. The house shook, and hunks of the street rained down on us like a shower. A boulder-shaped rock struck the roof and fell through it until it crashed into the ground level. The king bellowed out with surprise and huddled behind the guard. The guard looked either way around him, trying to pinpoint any more problems. I raised my weapon and laughed happily. It was all so easy. The guard fell to his knees after I left a fresh bullet hole in his armor. He made a faceplant at the feet of the king. The king hissed and leapt at me over the body and over the crater in the roof. I dodged him as he landed neatly next to me. I shot blindly at him, but missed by a long shot. Now I knew I only had one last bullet left in the pistol. I had to save it for the stone. The king clocked me upside my head. I saw stars, and then I fell to my hands and knees. I slipped down the roof. "You stupid mongrel! Look out at the portal!" the king laughed. I looked over towards that way. Out from the shadow world, more soldiers of their kind were charging at the battle. But civilians like the one I had killed inside were following after them, all clad with weapons. Women and children alike were all joining in, doubling their numbers. American soldiers were plowed down into the ground as the soldier people raged across the blood-soaked street. "No chance, huh?" the king laughed again, kicking at my gut. I rolled over and was able to get back up on my feet. I looked the grinning king square in the eye and punched him hard across the mouth. The king's head whipped back, and he collapsed, tangled in his velvet robe. I knelt down next to the dead bodyguard and dug savagely through his bloody armor and belt. The stone was nowhere to be found. Had I killed one of the other soldiers who had the stone? "Looking for this?" the king asked behind me. I turned swiftly around to see the king on his feet. He held the stone between his thin fingers, rolling it around to mock me. In his other hand he held a long, double-edged sword. He spit blood into the fire around him and chuckled into the red sky. He looked back at me with his cold stone eyes and smiled. "You can't stop this, human. This was written in the stars," the king screamed over the heavy machine gun fire. "I've waited all my life for this opportunity, and you won't get in my way." He lifted the sword above his head. I did the same with the pistol, which only had one more bullet. I had to remember what Joe had taught me at the firing range, to focus on your point and imagine yourself hitting the focus point in your mind. "Come on, you're the hero, right? Save the day," he moaned. "Kill me, come on, do it!" I screamed so loud it felt like my lungs expanded and popped. In my mind's eye, I imagined the stone exploding in a spark of light. I saw the king hurling off the roof in a spray of his blood, and I imagined the portal closing in a clean sweep. I pulled the trigger and saw what happened next in slow motion. The king laughed as he slashed his fine sword at the bullet with tiger-like reflexes. The bullet struck the sword, and the blade shattered in a shower of metallic blades. The king screamed as the shards of the sword struck him all across his gray face and in his neck. The bullet then hit the target, and just like in my mind, the king's hand twisted around the stone in a squelch of blood. The stone was struck, and it cracked down the middle. Then I was blinded by the explosion of solar bright light. I could still hear the king of the shadow world, howling with pain as he fell backwards off the roof, was obscured by sight from the pluming light. I fell back as well, the gun resting on my side. The battle below me seemed to halt as soldiers from both sides looked up at the magnificent light from the shattered stone. Then the portal to the left of me faded and started to slowly close. Electricity littered the blood-red sky of my world. The shadow creatures, seeing that their world was disappearing, leapt at it. One of them had taken the king's body with him. It closed, and the crowd of army men were either screaming in anger or triumph. I smiled happily as the one last shred of hope shined through the dark clouds. "Men, fall back!" I heard from the Americans below. I looked over the roof edge and saw that, as all the shadow men were distracted, the soldiers were taking off in their vehicles or on their own feet. "Well, take me with you," I tried to yell, but the United States Army was already out of the targeted area. So, at 5:43 p.m., on Bluebird Lane in Derwin, Colorado, the President of the United States broke open the envelope of Plan B. A heavy artillery missile was launched from Washington, D.C., and was already on its way. The shadow creatures looked up in fear at the missile enveloping the sky with its thick white smoke. It curved in the air, and its nose was pointed at George's old neighborhood. They all took off running, trampling over each other in their mad rush. I clutched my journal, that was still in my jeans, and huddled up against the warm shingles. I closed my eyes and waited for heaven's pearly gates. It passed right over my shaking body in a roar that shook the house and temporarily deafened me. Then, without any further notice, the missile struck the street only a few blocks up. There was the hot sting on my face and the feeling of the roof collapsing under me. I fell down into the licking flames, and the force of the explosion rocked me into unconsciousness. The shortest war in U.S. history of 3 days had just ended in a blinding blast heard from 5 states over. God bless America. Now, as the army men rooted through the rubble above the crater I lie in, I tried desperately to finish with my tale, although George's piano is crushing my lower body, and my left arm seems to be currently missing. I can't call out for the men above, because I have no more strength. I'm afraid my time is growing shorter, so I will have to end my story sometime. Hopefully someone will come upon this burnt journal so people can understand how and why this all happened and how I prevented the real Earth from being joined together once again. So as I lay here in this smoking crater of my own blood, accompanied by bodies of the unholy creatures I had warned Georges about from the very beginning, I still ponder over something. I hope on heaven's blue sky that when God created 3 stones and placed them on my earth, that he didn't also make 3 other stones to place on the shadow earth. We can only hope. Jim Sanders.